Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Last time, I did all of you a terrible disservice. I named that episode That Perfidious Pirate, and I failed to give any good reason for using a word like perfidious. When I told you that the British archives were rife with tales of John Ward in the months following the capture of the Rainiera y Soderina, I wasn't exaggerating. In fact, I might have downplayed it a bit. There was not a single letter or report or address from the English ambassador to Venice, nor the Venetian ambassador to London that failed to mention Jack Ward, even a year more after the event. Even when they became more concerned with other matters, every one of those communiques would end with an update about John Ward, or at least someone in his growing cabal of associates. So, for example, on 5 December 1607, Zorzi Giustinian, the Venetian ambassador to England, informed the Privy Council, quote, "A few days ago I heard from a good source that there was an English ship landing in Tunis with certain goods plundered from the Soderina. Her intention was to make for Flanders to dispose of her cargo the more safely. On the receipt of this news, I took such steps with the Lord High Admiral that as the ship was pushing up the channel, she was seized and taken into port where she is now lying. It seems that the information was correct, and her crew declare that her cargo consists of salt, indigo, and other goods. I hope not only to recover the interests of the injured parties, but also to deprive that perfidious pirate of a great incentive to continue his diabolical designs." End quote. I should have shared that last time. I love that quote. But that's the sort of information that was flowing constantly between Venice and England. And it wasn't just between those two countries. England and the Ottoman court were constantly arguing about whose responsibility it was to deal with the problem of Barbary pirates. "They're English," said the Sultan, "but it's an Ottoman port," said the king, and it just went on and on and on. Spain and Sicily and Tuscany all got in on the discussion, but as time went on, the Dutch joined in more and more. Eventually, they were involved in more of the discussion than anyone else, except for England, and that's because it became clear that Dutch pirates were flocking to follow John Ward's example in the Mediterranean. This is episode 88, Diabolical Designs. Today we're going to talk about two other pirates that followed to sail from Barbary in the wake of Captain Jack Ward. It's not exactly clear that they were following him. I mean, they did come to Barbary after John Ward, but they may not have exactly heard about Ward and his capture of the Soderina and immediately decided to follow in his footsteps. In one case, the steps that led this pirate to Barbary may have been very similar to Ward's, but in the other case, the events that brought him to Barbary were wildly different. But actually, that one, Ward might actually have influenced him. But before we begin, there is something that I want to bring up about these two stories, something that I want to point out. There is a very real discrepancy in the stories of these two pirates in, well, more than one way. But it comes down, at its center, to class and those who wrote history in the 1600s. Way back when we talked about and you Levu and women in piracy, during the buccaneering era at least, we talked a bit about who writes history. It was old, white men of privilege, and in that case, what concerned us about that fact was that they were men writing about men's experiences, and they left women underrepresented in the pages of history. And that's a problem in our current story as well, one that I've really had trouble overcoming. It might even be a worse problem than it was in the buccaneering era, and certainly in the Golden Age. I've been looking for women to talk about in this story, and I can't find any. Jack Ward had a wife back in England, and he reportedly sent her money, but nobody knows her name. She's just another nameless fisherman's wife abandoned by her husband. The story of piracy is filled with women like her, and we'll never know anything about them. There are women in the harems, but that's not exactly an inspiring story, and there will be a few women in the near future that I am going to talk about in this story. Not pirates, but women who survived attacks by Barbary pirates and the enslavement that followed. And then there were women who organized and agitated and facilitated the release of thousands of slaves. Those stories are among the most amazing and inspirational I've heard in the story of piracy, but we're not talking about them today. The reason I brought up this question of who writes history is because those same old privileged men that were ignoring women we're ignoring other disenfranchised people as well. And when I talk about privilege here, I'm not talking about what we might consider it today, white privilege or male privilege. They were certainly all white and male and all benefited from the privilege that gave them in England, but there was something more. They had the privilege of, education, first of all, that's central to the whole thing, but I'm talking about wealth. The historian and political scientist and socialist activist Michael Parenti said in a speech he gave about Julius Caesar, quote,
I want to say something about history first, because our images of the past are created largely by history's winners. The voices of the losers are muted, or if they come to us, they're through very carefully tuned filters. The writing of history has long been a privileged calling undertaken within the church, the royal court, the affluent townhouse, the government agency, the university, and the corporate-funded foundation. Edward Gibbon, the author of that monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, back in the late 18th century, was himself perfectly aware of the class realities behind the writing of history. He talked about how history had to be written by gentlemen. Isn't that interesting? Gentlemen who had the means, the leisure to pursue such a calling. In his words, wretched would be the work of those whose scholarly efforts, whose daily efforts are stimulated by daily hunger. Gibbon himself produced what I would call gentleman's history, a genre heavily imbued with an upper-class ideological perspective.
Now, Parenti is a historian with a clear bias and a political outlook. He's similar to Howard Zinn in a lot of ways. There's an element of looking for the facts that support his beliefs, and oftentimes they actually do so. But I'm not always on board with his analysis of history, nor his politics, but all the same, in this respect, I agree with him. Remember last time when we talked about the wealthy patrons that were necessary to get anything published? Well, they weren't about to finance a book that would make their class look bad. So keep in mind the question of the class and the outlook and the biases of those who were writing history when I talk about these next two pirates. The first one of these two in question was a man named Sir Francis Verney. Now, Sir Francis reminds me a lot of Stede Bonnet, one of Blackbeard's associates. Neither of them were very good pirates, but they hitched their names to much better captains, and therefore we remember them. Sir Francis was wholly unremarkable for his piracy, but he was well known, and he's actually one of the more interesting characters operating out of Barbary during these first years of the 17th century. Francis Verney was born in 1584 at Pindley Manor in Ting, Hertfordshire, England. He was the son of Sir Edmund Verney and a woman named Audrey Garner. His name, the Verney name, was old and distinguished. They were landed nobility, landlords going back generations deep into feudal England. Now, when Francis was only 4, his mother died. His father remarried to a woman named Lady Mary Blakeney. Now, Lady Mary was herself a powerful noblewoman with children and estates of her own. Sir Edmund Verney was married 3 times in all, and he had many children. Through his father's marriages, young Francis had at least 7 familial connections to the courts of the Tudor dynasty of England and the Stuart dynasty in Scotland. Now, Francis would never have actually been in line for the throne himself. Hundreds of people would have had to die first, and well before he made his way to the throne, the nobility of England would have looked outside the country. But Lady Mary was described as a, quote, masterful woman, and, well, I hate to fall into the evil stepmother trope here, but this one here probably actually kind of fits. See, when he was still very young, Francis was deeded a significant parcel of land by his uncle, Sir Edmund's brother. Now, his uncle died, and Francis received that land before Lady Mary entered the picture. However, Lady Mary convinced her husband, Sir Edmund Verney, to overwrite his brother's last will and testament to split the land between Francis and his new, younger half-brother, the son of Sir Edmund and Lady Mary. And this was no small feat. He didn't just have to scratch out a few lines. He had to go to Parliament and get a special act to get this done. And then, in a move that just seems comically calculated to secure her own hold on the rest of the land, that belonged to Francis, Lady Mary and Sir Edmund arranged a marriage between Francis and his significantly older stepsister Ursula. That's Lady Mary's daughter from a previous marriage. Francis was only 15 at the time. And then, less than a year later, when Francis was still only 16, still a minor, and yet married, his father died. And Lady Mary, well, I ain't saying she's a gold digger, but she did marry an older man and convince him to go before Parliament to secure her dead brother-in-law's land for her 2 children. Francis was still a minor here. He had no control over his money or his estates or his destiny. He was unable to argue when his stepmother walked in, did what she wanted to with it, and then packed him off to private school. Imagine how he would have felt in that carriage ride with only a trunk full of his own clothes to keep him company, being driven from his home mere months after the death of his father. He was Sir Edmund's eldest son, and yet here he was, forced from a home that should have been his by rights by his stepmother/mother-in-law. How would he feel about her? That woman came in, stole half of the land that he owned by giving it to his younger half-brother. Oh, and his younger half-brother's name? Edmund, his father's name. Then Lady Mary forced him to marry an older woman, his stepsister, which effectively stole the rest of his land. See, that half that still belonged to Francis now in part belonged to his wife and his stepmother, who was his legal guardian. Now he was on the way to a strange town and a strange school while a family of strangers that called themselves his wife and mother and brother sat in his father's home getting rich off of the land. How would that make you feel? Do you think perhaps you would consider an act of Shakespearean tragic violence? Now, as soon as Francis reached his majority, he made 3 major changes. First, he was knighted at the Tower of London and officially became Sir Francis. Second, he bought a house in town, far from his wife and far from his mother-in-law. Third, he legally separated from his wife. He agreed to pay her a yearly stipend of £50. This move probably felt pretty good, but it proved to be his undoing. See, after separating from his wife, he took his case before Parliament. He wanted his land back. He argued that his wife and his mother-in-law had stolen his lands, and it was really kind of a strong case. The problem comes, well, first of all of his family's lawyers who would have normally represented him, well, they were all paid by Lady Mary. And then, when he separated legally from his wife, that gave her some claim over the land. So Parliament ruled in Lady Mary's favor, and Sir Francis Verney lost that parcel of land. Now, he had a few other holdings, although less significant. He hadn't received nearly as much from his father as he had expected, mostly because his father had rewritten the will. But he did have those other parcels, so he sold them. He sold his house in London as well, nearly all of his worldly possessions. According to family legend, he kept only a few changes of clothes, a purse full of coin, and his father's sword. With the money that he had in his pocket, he booked passage on a ship. And isn't that just a great origin story for a gentleman pirate? Couldn't you see Sir Francis Verney leading a mutiny, taking his ship to the West Indies and gathering a crew? He might dress according to his station, as a gentleman, and then shipwreck outside an island called Never Never Land, where he loses a hand and vows revenge upon Peter Pan. Black Sails had a much better origin story for Captain Flint, but I could see something like this story working as well for any of the high Golden Age pirates, really. But that wouldn't really be plausible for a few decades yet. The taking his ship to the West Indies, When Sir Francis left England and his estranged wife's sister and her mother behind, most of the world was still out of the question for an Englishman. Instead, Sir Francis went to Morocco. He had family there, see, a man named Captain John Gifford and then his lieutenant, Philip Gifford. The Giffords were commanders in a combined English and Dutch mercenary force. That mercenary force was fighting in Morocco on behalf of the Sultan, the rightful Sultan as they saw it, or at least as his coin convinced them to see it, and Sir Francis joined up with them. And now, here's where things start to get complicated. The Sultan for which they were fighting was a Berber national. They were fighting against a rebellion begun by Arab princes in the south of Morocco that were exiles from the Caliphate of Cordoba. Does any of this sound familiar? It's all part of that story of the Moroccan Sephardi pirate Samuel Palash. Remember the Moroccan smuggler turned pirate turned spy in King Philip II's court, chased out of Madrid by the Inquisition and fighting his way to freedom? He was an agent of that same sultan for which the Giffords and now Sir Francis were fighting. Currently, he was engaged in high diplomatic talks with the Dutch Republic. And these Englishmen were working against Ottoman influence in Morocco. Now, I'm not saying that Samuel Palash organized these Dutch and English mercenaries to help his sultan, because I don't have any evidence that he did so. But I'm not saying it didn't happen either. But things are about to get even more complicated. John and Philip Gifford were relatives of Sir Francis, but they had another relative operating in North Africa, and he was also working against Ottoman influence in the region. His name was Richard Gifford, and we've talked about him before. He was that man that ingratiated himself with the Pasha of Algiers and then took a contract from the Duke of Tuscany to burn the entire fleet of Algiers at anchor in the harbor there. He was that Englishman that caused so much trouble for John Ward before he arrived in Barbary. Did you follow all of that? Sir Francis Verney was working for his relatives, all of whom were employed by a Dutch and English mercenary company employed by the Moroccan Sultan. The Sultan was working closely with Samuel Palash, noted pirate, and through him to the Dutch Republic. All of them were working on some level against the Ottoman Empire, or at least against Turkish and Arabian influence. And then think about the Janissaries over in Tunis, led by Uthman Bey, who were in open rebellion against their Ottoman Sultan. They were encouraging corsairs and piracy to serve as a de facto navy and to bring in funds. Now, I'm not saying that the Dutch Republic and the Moroccan Sultanate were secretly conspiring through their agent Samuel Palash to encourage the Barbary corsairs, which would destabilize Ottoman and Spanish and Italian hegemony in the region, all while empowering the Dutch and the Moroccans to nibble at the Spanish and Ottoman empires. I'm not saying that the Gifford family, including Sir Francis Verney, were elbow deep in the said conspiracy, working extranationally to enrich themselves and their overseas holdings at the expense of Spain. I'm sure it's all merely a coincidence. I'm sure it's merely coincidence that the Giffords served in the Netherlands during the Dutch Revolt, and that they would go on to be key players in the expansion of Dutch interests in the East Indies at the expense of Portugal and Spain. I'm not saying that any of it is connected. I don't have any documentation to back that up. And I am certainly not once again delving into 400-year-old conspiracy theories, because that would be the action of a crazy person, and I'm not crazy. But I will, once again, quote Michael Parenti. In that same speech about Julius Caesar, he said, quote,
"One eminent 20th century British historian, Cyril Robinson, offers the familiar and fanciful notion of an empire achieved stochastically. Stochasticism is the theory that all things happen by chance, without deliberate intent by the actors above, without conscious design. I quote Robinson, "It was perhaps almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain that she acquired her world domination in a fit of absence of mind." Yeah, right. Again, a fairy tale image. An imperialism without imperialists. Isn't that remarkable? Well, what do you have, a conspiracy theory? You think they actually built this empire? Planned and went out and did things and calculated and raised armies and decided that was a profitable area to conquer? You think they actually thought about that? It was absent-minded.
And I'm not saying that Uthman Bey and the Janissaries and Jack Ward and Sir Francis were all caught up in this hypothetical conspiracy. I'm just relaying historical data and pointing out the coincidences I see. I'm just asking questions here. And really, in reality, most of the actors present were probably just taking advantage of the situation that presented itself. But if there were a vast international conspiracy involving pirates to destabilize an empire and a region, well, it wouldn't be the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Now, John and Philip Gifford, the English leaders in that mercenary company, would both be killed in a skirmish in the desert with the Arab forces against which they were fighting. Verney family tradition tells us that it was at this time that Sir Francis met with that other family member, Richard Gifford, to learn about seafaring and privateering and life in Barbary. And that story makes sense. It adds a certain dramatic flair to the whole thing, and it ties the tale up nicely. So naturally, it's not true. As Adrian Tinniswood points out, Richard Gifford was in a Florentine jail between 1607 and 1610. But there, if that's not what happened, we lose touch with Francis Verney for a while. But if you need more circumstantial evidence to support a claim that I am absolutely not making about an international conspiracy between the Netherlands and Morocco, and eventually England and Barbary, you don't need to look any further than our next major player. He was born sometime around 1579 in the Netherlands. Now, he may have been born in Dordrecht in Holland, or he may have been from a place called Vlissingen, what the English called Flushing. There are differing accounts about the date and the place of his birth. His name is even more complicated. His real name was probably Simon Dansicker, but the English among his crews often called him Simon Dancer, and history best remembers him as Simon Dansicker. So that's what we're going to go with. His early life is much less defined than that of Sir Francis, at least in English sources. His story is not dissimilar to that of John Ward, though. He was a privateer during the war with Spain. He was fighting for the Dutch rather than the English, but they were on the same side. Now, he wasn't yet born when William the Silent sent the Zee rovers a-roving, but serving on board a privateer vessel would have appealed to a young, ambitious, patriotic Dutchman. He was Protestant, a Calvinist probably, and he earned his first defeat at sea, I don't believe he was yet a commander, at the hands of Irish Catholic pirates. And when I say Irish pirates, I mean the navy of the revolutionary forces in Northern Ireland that fought the 9 Years' War at sea. And when I talk about the Irish Revolutionary Navy, I'm talking about the force that was commanded and in many ways built by a woman named Grace O'Malley. Now, by the time Dansicker would have been captured, Grace O'Malley had been retired from the sea for some time, so we can banish the images of her bright red locks streaming in the wind, brandishing her cutlass over a captured Simon Dansicker. And in fact, she might have actually been dead by the time Simon was captured. We don't know exactly when he was captured, nor do we know exactly when Grace O'Malley died. But it was those same pirates, and, well, really pirates isn't a word you should use here. I'm sure that Grace O'Malley would have taken great offense at it. They were a revolutionary navy. The only people who considered them pirates were the English against whom they were fighting. It was that Irish Revolutionary Navy, which Grace O'Malley had been so integral in creating and building up, it was those men that captured Simon Dansicker and his crewmates. In fact, very likely sons and or brothers of Grace O'Malley were there. Now, we know virtually nothing else about the early life of Simon Dansicker or his days as a Dutch privateer. We don't even know how he escaped the Irish pirate navy. He was probably freed when the war ended, which would have been only a few months after he was captured, but we still don't know. The next time that Simon Dansicker pops up on the historical radar is when he moved to Marseille in France. The reason he does pop up is because he married the governor's daughter. Now, this kind of suggests to me, well, first of all, it suggests that he might not actually have been Dutch, or maybe the records are somewhat confused here, but more on that later. But it also suggests that he may have been a man of some standing. He would have been about 27 years old right now, and probably an officer at this point. I mean, not just any pirate fresh off the boat from the Netherlands gets to marry the governor's daughter, right? But then he ran into some trouble there in Marseille. Exactly what the trouble is, we don't know. Adrian Tinniswood writes that he, quote, quarreled with the authorities, who presumably included his father-in-law. In 1607, he stole a ship in Marseille harbor, used her to take another, and set out to sell his prizes in Algiers. End quote. Now, there is another account, which I will relate in a moment, but that's basically all we have that is verifiable about Simon Dansicker's road to Barbary. At least that's all that I have in English. There are Dutch and even Arabic sources, but they cost a fortune and are hard to come by even if you can afford them. But here's why I started out today talking about wealth and privilege in historical writing. We have this fascinating, emotionally engaging, in-depth origin story about Sir Francis Verney on the one hand, and even the rest of his tale, at least parts of it, are equally fascinating. But Francis Verney was a terrible pirate. But then on the other hand, Simon Dansicker. We know very little about him, at least until he turned pirate and all of a sudden everyone was very interested in him. But we don't know his name, his place of birth, his date of birth. We don't know anything about his service in the Dutch Revolt. We don't know his rank if he had one. Honestly, it's questionable that he ever actually married any governor's daughter. That comes from a 400-year-old piece of hearsay that just has been repeated often enough that it's become historical fact. But Simon Dansicker, of whom we know virtually nothing in his early life, was a fantastic pirate, an amazing pirate even. He arrived in Algiers in late 1608, and by summer of 1609, he had taken over 29 ships ranging from Spain and England and France and even the Netherlands. Jack Ward did well for himself, but not 29 ships in a few short months well. Now, none of the prizes taken by Simon Dansicker were anywhere near as rich as the Rainiera y Soderina or even the likes of the Ruby. But Simon Dansicker always played second fiddle, to John Ward at least. Perhaps that's just national bias. For example, in A True and Certain Report of the Beginning Proceedings, Overthrows and Now Present Estate of Captain Ward and Dansicker, we get pages and pages and pages devoted to Ward and his many exploits. And then, at the very end, a single paragraph about Simon Dansicker. And the same rings true, to differing levels of effect, on any of the contemporary works devoted to those two pirates. The British Archives, Dansicker doesn't get a single mention. And I mean, that makes sense. He wasn't British. He was Dutch, so why would the English be writing about him? But what that doesn't account for is Sir Francis Verney. Verney was also English, so there could be similar reasons, but both Venice and France, in the reports of their agents in Barbary, back to people in Venice and Paris, well, they seemed to care a lot more about Sir Francis, an absolutely abysmal pirate, than one of the most successful pirates of his age, a man who was arguably more successful than John Ward. And I would argue here that this is because of class bias. They were more interested in telling the stories of the gentry because they related more closely to those stories. They called him a pirate of, quote, the most noble blood, end quote, and they wrote about his trials and tribulations at length, almost sympathetically. And then Dansicker? He was billed by those same agents as one of Ward's lieutenants, just an underling. And then, when Dansicker split from Ward, according to these agents, it was over a petty argument over a small amount of their spoils, you know, the sort of argument that poor people partake in. And all of that is just nonsense. Dansicker was never Ward's lieutenant. Tunis was never his port of call. He never worked for Uthmanday. It wasn't just the English that were painting Dansicker as a lesser pirate than John Ward and Sir Francis Verney, the Venetians, the Dutch, even the Spanish and the Ottomans to some extent, but I think the facts will show that he was a far better pirate than anyone else operating at the time. As a further piece of evidence of class bias in older piratical historical texts, I'd like to read to you from The History of Piracy by Philip Gosse, published in 1932. Now, Philip Gosse wasn't landed gentry. This was 1932, there weren't many of them left. He was the grandson of a famous naturalist, though, the son of a famous poet, and himself a well-known academic. All of them had a Sir before their name, and, to be fair, they all earned it. All of their works were amazing, but they were not the sort of stock from which men like Ward and Dansicker came. Gosse wrote, quote, Dansicker found the temptations of that lively port too much for him. Having spent all his money, he was forced to sell his ship and spend the proceeds of that as well. Thus deprived, he collected a few of the riffraff of the port, stole a small boat, and went out on the account. End quote. And that's not all necessarily incorrect. He was probably in some form of financial straits. That's likely what got him into trouble with the law in the first place, but We can't trust Philip Ghost because so much of the other information he provides is verifiably incorrect. And then see how Ghost paints him in the light of drunken debauch. When he says temptations of the port, what he means is wine and women. His crew were all riffraff. And, they probably were riffraff, to be fair, but that ignores the crippling taxes and lingering feudal system that was placed upon them, and the thousands of them that had fathers lying dead in foreign soil for some king's war somewhere. So my goal is to try to tell the story of Simon Dansicker as best as I can, with the limited sources I have, to give him an honest and fair account. He arrived in Algiers shortly after the capture of the Soterina, around the same time that Verney arrived in Barbary. It's actually possible that Sir Francis and Dansicker were in Algiers at the same time. It likely would have been the first major port either of them reached after leaving the Strait of Gibraltar. But if Sir Francis were in the company of his cousin Richard Giffard, even though he was in jail at the time, they would have been unlikely to stop off in Algiers. Giffard still had an Algerian price on his head. But if, on the other hand, Verney was there, he likely wouldn't have stayed anyway. He probably would have received the same reception that the Pasha gave John Ward and the other Englishmen with him. Not necessarily arrest, but not a welcoming hand either. But Simon Dansicker wasn't English, and the Pasha was willing to let him stay. Now, exactly what his role was there in Algiers is up for debate, at least at first. He almost certainly pirated around for a while, taking those 29 ships and selling his goods in Algiers. As a corsair who was essentially a privateer, he would have given the Pasha his cut, so the Pasha made money, and Captain Dansicker was able to ingratiate himself into the culture of Algiers. Now, Dansicker would go on to become for much more famous acts of piracy. Some of those would garner as much attention even in England as Ward and the Rainiera y Soterina. They would make him an arch-pirate alongside Captain Ward. They would even potentially make him a greater threat. He would leave the title of arch-pirate behind and become the devil captain of the Mediterranean. And we're going to talk about all of that in the days to come. It's a fascinating story, but for now, I want to look at the slightly less exciting but significantly more influential aspect of Simon Dansicker's time in Algiers. Now, there's no big battle or exciting conclusion, which I like to do when possible, but as I said, I want to give him a fair and honest accounting. Once Dansicker was established in Algiers, he presented himself to the Pasha and offered him his service. This would have been probably after taking those 29 ships. Now, Algiers was still under Ottoman control, unlike Tunis, and they had a kind of revolving door policy for the Pashas to keep them from gaining too much power. Pashas would serve for a term of a year. Occasionally the Sultan would extend their term for an additional year, up to 4 years, but no longer than that. There was a Janissary garrison there in Algiers, and frankly, he probably presented himself to them as well. But the Pasha's name was Redwan. Now, there was a powerful family in the Ottoman Empire called the Ridwan dynasty. They served as pashas and beylerbeys and even viziers to the Sultan at different times. Their influence was vast, everywhere from Egypt to Jerusalem and the Levant to Turkey, and it lasted for several generations. Now, this Pasha Redwan may have been a member of their clan, or he may just have a similar name. If he was a member of the Ridwan clan, he was not a famous member of it. Regardless, the Pasha Redwan knew his time as Pasha was growing short. He wanted something that would impress the Sultan, and what he had was Simon Dansicker. The service that Simon offered Redwan was to teach his shipwrights how to build ships that would match even the best ship in Europe. It would take time to do so, but they could do it. See, Dansicker has been given credit for modernizing the navy of Algiers, and he likely deserves that credit. If not all of it, at least most of it. He was Dutch, after all, and in 1608 the Dutch were building the best ships in the world. Now, the Ottomans had been transitioning from oar power to sail power for a while now. The Battle of Lepanto showed them that the galleys were not suitable warships in the age of sail and gunpowder, and they did have some fairly decent ships. The best of these was the Dhow. The dhow was actually a wide variety of ships, but they were usually open-decked, single-masted ships with a settee or lateen rigging. That's a triangular sail. Now, the dhow was fast, and it worked well for coastal trade and for corsairs in most situations. But they weren't strong ships. They weren't powerful like the big European ships. They couldn't hold many guns on board, and they could not endure hits like a European ship could. But Simon Dansicker was going to change all of that. He introduced to Algiers the round ship. Now, there are two defining characteristics to the round ship. First, square-rigged sails. Now, the Sephardi exiles had already brought the square rig into Turkey and Barbary, and they were occasionally put into use on dhows, but more frequently on galleys. And they were put to some great successes, but by the 1600s, even a square-rigged galley wasn't good enough. But the second defining characteristic of the round ship is the hull. Most medieval ships were what they called clinker-built. That is, every timber used in building the hull was first shaped and then put together in a slightly overlapping pattern. This was efficient, it was cheap to build, and it was waterproof. I mean, you can look at a Viking longship if you want to see what this looks like. But Europeans had begun building their hulls in what they called a caravel build. The first of these ships was, not surprisingly, the caravel designed by Portugal in the 14th century. What made a caravel build different is that the planks making up the hull didn't overlap. They were perfectly fitted into a longitudinal seam. That meant their hulls were smooth. You can see the advantages immediately. A smooth hull would be vastly more hydrodynamic than a jagged hull, so they were faster. They used about half as much timber to build them since they didn't overlap, so they were lighter on the water, and that means less water was displaced, which means that they could usually rely solely on sail power. It took a lot less power for one of these caravel-built ships to move. But here's the big stuff that might not jump out at you, at least it didn't jump out to me. First of all, since they were perfectly fitted, smooth hulls, one was able to fit 2 or 3 layers of hull on one of these ships. You couldn't do that with a jagged hull. And with a layered hull, cannonballs would just bounce right off, at least until cannons would get better. The caravel-built ships were significantly more structurally sound. They used a sort of tension to hold together, so they weren't brittle like the clankers. That means that they could do 3 things. First, they could have multiple decks. That meant more guns and more cargo, and that's a big win. Second, they could accommodate more than one mast on board without losing any of the strength of the hull. The dhow had only one mast on nearly all of their designs. There were a few multi-masted galleys, but those were a different build entirely, and something that really wasn't done much since the fall of the Byzantine Empire. But obviously, more masts mean more sails, which means an even faster ship that can use more of that wind power to cut through the waves. So they were faster, they were lighter, and they could hold many more guns. But then third, and this one is a much bigger deal than I would ever have thought, I actually would never have thought about this at all, these caravel-built ships could actually twist a little bit in the middle. That means that they were capable of sudden changes in direction without damaging the hull. That made them extremely maneuverable. And what's more, it allowed ships built this way to brave the tempests and the waves of the high seas. Nearly all of the ships that have ever concerned us on this show, the ships of Henry the Navigator when he explored Africa and the Atlantic Ocean, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, they were all caravel-built. All of the ships that the pirates used during the buccaneering age, from Henry Morgan to Lolo Ney, caravel-built ships, except when they had to build a small vessel out of rough materials, then it was much more economic to build one in an older style. But it was those ships that allowed Europe to become the dominant sea power in the world for hundreds of years. That ship design was responsible for everything. Exploration and colonization, for trade, at least the domination of trade by Europe, for imperialism, and the naval arms race that lasted for centuries, not to mention pirates and piracy as we know and love them. It's responsible for this show. And Simon Dansicker, a Dutchman, brought that technology to the Muslim world, to Algiers. He taught their shipwrights how to build those ships, but he did more than that. He taught them how to train a new generation of shipwrights. He oversaw the construction of new tools and shipyards. He targeted ships as a pirate that were carrying lumber and guns to further his aims here. He ordered trees planted outside the city. They had to build a fairly extensive aqueduct system to use these trees, but it was absolutely worth it. Now, this was all a lengthy process. This took years and years before they had a fully fledged navy. But in under a year, Simon Dansicker, a Dutchman, had come to Algiers, constructed at least half a dozen large, powerful warships, men of war essentially, and he was the only captain in Algiers that knew how to properly utilize them. That meant that he was not only the captain of his ship, he was the admiral of all 6 ships, and as they were the most powerful ships in the Algerian navy, he was the admiral of the Algerian fleet. But every good admiral knows that you have to put new ships and new sailors through their paces. You have to be sure that the ships won't leak and sink. You have to be sure that the sailors will know what they're doing, and obviously you can't just let your new ships rot there in port. So next time, we're going to discuss exactly what Admiral Simon Dansicker did with his brand new navy. If you're interested in hearing that speech that I played a couple of clips from today by Michael Parenti about Julius Caesar, I certainly suggest you listen to it. You can find it on YouTube. It's called The Death of Julius Caesar by Michael Parenti. But I'd like to warn you that he does have that political bias, and I don't think that everything he says in there should be taken at face value. Take it all with a grain of salt, and imbibe as much more Roman history as possible. I would suggest, first of all, the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, and while you're at it, why not read his book, The Storm Before the Storm, about the civil war that preceded Julius Caesar and that civil war. But you should also check out some other sources. If you'd like to know what Julius Caesar wants you to think about his policies, and not just what Michael Parenti or Mike Duncan want you to, he has his journals out there. They were propaganda, but they're worth taking a look at, or at least listening to or reading about them and what he says in them. And I would also suggest the book Rubicon, and of course, Dan Carlin's series, Death Throes of the Republic. Rome and Roman history, even the late Republic, even just the story of Julius Caesar, is a huge topic. And that's, at best, a good place to start. Back during the Dutch revolt in the latter years of the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth of England appointed a member of Parliament named Sir Thomas Shirley to serve as the treasurer at war to the English forces on the continent. Sir Thomas was notably bad at his job. He used crown funds for wild investments and money-making schemes. Now, this was accepted behavior in his position. However, people in that position were expected to be good at it. They were intended to grow the seed capital provided by the crown to fund the army, without making the crown spend any more money. But Sir Thomas failed to do this. He actually found himself in considerable debt to both Dutch and English interests, including Queen Elizabeth herself. His 2 eldest sons were serving on the continent with him in the army, but considering their financial straits, they elected to stop serving in the army, to buy a couple of ships, and to go out privateering. It might not have the same honor attached to it, but it was certainly a lot more profitable. His eldest son was also named Thomas, and also knighted. He was Sir Thomas the Younger, and he did very well as a privateer. In fact, it was Sir Thomas the Younger that pulled the family back from the brink of ruin. He roved the Atlantic coast west of Spain and captured ships that were filled with Spanish sugar and silver. Now, this was all perfectly legal privateering, but there was some nefarious political wrangling behind the scenes concerning Sir Thomas the Younger. There were other noble families that wanted to see the House of Shirley fall. They saw a weak and sick member of the pack, so they wanted to swoop in and claim their lands. But Thomas the Younger, through his privateering, forestalled this. Some of the heads of those other noble families were members of the Admiralty, and they brought Thomas before them on charges of high seas piracy. Now, Thomas was briefly jailed, but he had enough powerful friends that he escaped mostly unscathed. But his younger brother, Sir Anthony Shirley, and he was actually the middle brother in a trio, but we don't need to talk about the third brother, Sir Anthony had bigger ideas. He wanted to travel not to the Channel and not to the west coast of Spain or even the west coast of Africa. He wanted to travel to the source of all of that Spanish wealth, and he wanted to fill his ship with silver and gold. Maybe, just maybe, he would be able to capture one of the fabled Spanish treasure galleons and return home to England, one of the richest men in his kingdom. That is a big idea. It's bold, but he certainly found a crew that wanted in. The crew armed themselves and their ship, and they provisioned as well as possible, and they set sail south in 1596. Now, first, they ravaged the Portuguese slaver colonies in Africa. This was a first stop for anyone traveling to the New World, but then they headed west across the Atlantic. However, he and his crew endured a terrible crossing. There were shortages, there were storms. A few men died in the crossing. However, they made it. And Sir Anthony found himself in the shoes of the English hero Francis Drake, who was still alive at this time. Sir Anthony had a ship that was full of stolen slaves. He may have had some gold or ivory, but he also had an armed crew, and he had nowhere to sell the slaves that he had stolen. You may recall the tale of John Hawkins and the battle and betrayal that Sir Francis Drake endured. Sir Anthony wanted to avoid that at all costs. However, he would find that his situation was quite different. This is episode 89, Death and Destiny. Sir Anthony's West Indian adventure would not have the same swashbuckling conclusion as Drake's infamous battle in the Gulf of Mexico, and it wouldn't even come close to Drake's capture of the Spanish silver mule train outside of Nombre de Dios. Sir Anthony's crew mutinied shortly after arriving in the Caribbean, and it wasn't one of the cool mutinies. The crew didn't want to turn pirate and abandon England and live lives of ease and excess. No, they were really far from home. They didn't have much in the way of food or supplies, and all they wanted was to go back to England. So they mutinied. Now, Sir Anthony managed to keep control of his ship, but he did so by agreeing to take them back to England. And there was a slight problem here. By the time they got back to England, Queen Elizabeth was dead, and James Stuart was on the throne of England. And in the reign of King James I, English eyes were all turned toward the horizon. There was a great race on at sea to conquer the world. Portugal and Spain were leagues ahead of anyone else. They had the New World, Africa, and Southeast Asia in their hands already. The seas, almost everywhere, were commanded by Spanish galleons that routinely traversed the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans with holds full of wealth extracted from those foreign soils and the blood of their native peoples. But they had been on top for a long time, and the other nations of Europe all wanted in on the game, especially since they sensed Spain was weak after the death of Philip II. But they couldn't just jump in and take over. See, Sir Anthony was ahead of his time when he sailed west to the New World. England wasn't ready for that quite yet. Instead, England decided to dip her toes into waters much closer to home. There was a bit of maneuvering in the North Sea concerning Russia and Denmark and the Nordic countries, but primarily they dipped their toes into the Mediterranean. Now, the Mediterranean already had major players. There was Spain, obviously, but then there were all of the Italian city-states and principalities and kingdoms and republics, and then there was the Ottoman Empire. But England had big plans to join the fray in the Mediterranean. Now, the elder Shirley brother, Sir Thomas the Younger, well, he was currently employed by one of those Italian lords, the Duke of Tuscany. He was serving as a privateer against the Ottoman Empire. This was precisely the sort of good, upstanding work that any young English nobleman should have been up to. This was the sort of thing that, though it wasn't technically part of his mandate, the king and council and the nobility of England could all get behind. This is what Sir Anthony should have been doing instead of marauding in the New World. Sir Anthony found himself, well, he wasn't so gainfully employed as his brother. After the mutiny, when he got back to England, he was hauled before the Admiralty on charges of high seas piracy. Now, this was similar to what his brother had experienced. However, unlike the political background behind the trial of the elder brother, these charges looked a lot more legitimate. Sir Anthony argued before the Admiralty that he was unaware of King James' proclamation against privateering. He argued that he had a proper privateering commission from Queen Elizabeth to raid the Spanish and didn't know that these had gone away. And he actually might have been telling the truth here. But it looked an awful lot like he sailed for the West Indies to circumvent the prohibition laid down by King James. Sir Anthony lost his trial. He was convicted and jailed. Now, his father, the elder Sir Thomas, had been a member of Parliament. Sir Thomas the younger and Sir Anthony, his two eldest sons, had both served in Parliament as well. They had been elected to the House of Commons at, various times during their life. They were landed nobility. They were knights, and, they weren't the sort of common pirates that the Admiralty seemed to be making them out to be. So their peers in the Parliament, many of whom they knew personally, many of whom they were related to, they drafted up a document called the Form of Apology and Satisfaction. This document was drafted by the House of Commons and presented to King James. Now remember, James was a Scotsman. He was not a native Englishman, not in the eyes of the English people at least. This letter was presented to King James, and it called him a foreign king to his face. But then it went further. It called the king ignorant of the House of Commons, quote, privileges and liberties, end quote. There were a number of issues here. There were land rights in question, which James was stomping all over. There were questions of taxation as well. Elizabeth had always had a light touch when it came to taxation, if at all possible, but King James did not. But then there was a central issue that was perhaps more personal to the members of the House of Commons. There was the imprisonment of two men who had at times been members of their house, Sir Thomas and Sir Anthony Shirley. They demanded that Sir Anthony be released from prison and pardoned immediately. This document is actually a fairly substantial piece of English history. It wasn't exactly the first time that the Parliament had stood up to King James, but it was the first truly notable time that the House of Commons officially stood up to the king. Remember, the House of Stuart was upsetting a lot of people in England, especially the Parliament, and, they were well on their way to a civil war. Sir Anthony didn't necessarily know any of that, but he likely knew that there was that simmering tension between the Parliament and the king. He was a part of that at times, and he likely knew that this document was responsible for his pardon and release. But he decided not to press his luck there in England. He left those shores almost immediately. Sir Anthony's story after leaving England is one of those adventure tales that I greatly admire. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of someone like William Dampier. Now, he wasn't an intellectual or a scientist at all, but he did travel the world, and he did run into piracy many times in his life. The first stop after leaving England was Russia. There were some business connections with the Shirley family in Russia, and during Elizabeth's reign, there had been a lot of diplomatic relations established. But then he traveled overland through northeastern Europe and then made his way to Vienna in Austria, where he met the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II. Now, Rudolph was eager to meet with Sir Anthony. He already knew his brothers, Sir Thomas and the youngest brother, Robert. In fact, in a way, Sir Thomas the Younger sort of worked for Rudolph II. The Duke of Tuscany, Sir Thomas's primary employer, was an ally and sort of a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, we've talked about Rudolph before when we discussed the lead-up to the 30 Years' War. He usually takes a little bit of blame in that story because, well, he was a hands-off sort of emperor. He had a progressive, conciliatory attitude towards Protestantism. He was much more concerned with the Ottoman Empire, hence employing English privateers. But his brother, his successor, would not be. Had Rudolph not had such a hands-off approach, and his brother not had such a hands-on approach, there wouldn't have been such a drastic change in policy that would inflame the Protestants there in Germany and set Europe on fire. Now, that's all in the future of the story and the past of this podcast, but for the moment, Rudolph II had a request for Sir Anthony. His cousin, Philip III of Spain, needed a good man to serve in the Mediterranean and the African coast. And I'm fairly certain that the closest relationship we can use to describe Rudolph II and Philip III is cousin, but I'm not necessarily positive. Charles V was both of their grandfathers, so they were cousins at least, but the House of Habsburg in this period was so intermarried that their family tree begins to look like maybe a braid or maybe a DNA strand, ironically enough. Rudolph's mother married her first cousin, the nephew of Charles V, and they gave birth to Rudolph and his sister. Then Rudolph's sister married her own uncle, Philip II of Spain. She was his fourth wife, and he was significantly older than her, but their son, Philip III, was Rudolph's nephew and his cousin. Then Rudolph's, I'm fairly certain she was his aunt, Margaret of Austria. She was married to Philip III, Rudolph's nephew and the current king of Spain. And Margaret of Austria was actually Philip III's first cousin once removed, and now she was his wife. And I won't even begin to get into who their kids were and how they were related or who they'll marry, at least not today. All of that is way off topic for today, but I am really looking forward to talking about the War of the Spanish Succession. This is just crazy to me. But back to our story. Rudolph II was sending Sir Anthony to meet with Philip III, his nephew cousin, and his wife, Margaret of Spain, Rudolph's aunt-niece. Now, Margaret was the real power in that marriage. She was the real power in Spain. By one account, Philip III was an undistinguished and insignificant man, and that seemed to be the consensus. However, his wife, Margaret, had a better mind for ruling. And I don't mean to diminish what may have just been an intelligent mind and natural talent, but Margaret's parents were, at least a little bit, less related than Philip III's were. So she may have had something of a head start on her husband. But upon his arrival in Spain, Sir Anthony was made the admiral of the Spanish fleet in the Mediterranean. This is not an insignificant feat for an Englishman who fought the Spanish in the Dutch Revolt. An Englishman who sailed to the New World with the intention of capturing a Spanish treasure galleon, if at all possible. But he did have the street cred of having been jailed by the King of England and then all but exiled from his home. The Queen of Spain may have seen a certain proclivity to act against the English in him. At the moment, as admiral of the Spanish fleet in the Mediterranean, his duties were going to be dealing with Morocco. In fact, that was probably why he was given the position here. See, Spain and Morocco were a lot less close than they had been. This was right about 1606, late in 1606, and Samuel Palache was busy orchestrating the alliance between the Moroccan Sultan and Maurice of Nassau. Now, the Sultan, the Moroccan Sultan, was unlikely to welcome a Spaniard into his court, but an emissary from Spain that was English, a former enemy of Spain's, would show the goodwill and air of mutual forgiveness that Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain, was willing to show. It was, I think, a brilliant political move. Now, Sir Anthony's job there in Morocco, aside from showing how kind-hearted Margaret of Spain could be, was to convince the Moroccan Sultan that an alliance with Spain was a far better proposition than an alliance with the Netherlands. And he arrived in Morocco to do that job in July of 1607. Last time, I wildly speculated that there may have been a grand conspiracy between the Sultan of Morocco and Maurice of Nassau and Samuel Palash and maybe Uthman Dey using the Barbary pirates to destabilize the Ottoman presence in the Mediterranean. There were other actors in that conspiracy, if one did exist, English actors, who would have been working for the Sultan with the Dutch. If there were any truth in that conspiracy, Sir Anthony immediately began to work against it, against his former countrymen who were working for the Sultan, and against the Dutch. He was doing the job that he had been contracted to do by the Queen of Spain in favor of Spain's interests, but also in favor of England's prerogative. When he arrived in Fez, the capital of Morocco, the hometown of Samuel Palash, he was immediately noticed there as an Englishman. He secured the meetings he needed to secure, and he began to do his job in discussing terms with advisors and viziers, and perhaps even the Sultan himself, but at every turn, every time he managed to make a little bit of headway, he was hindered. Anyone that he spoke with wanted to stop the conversation, stop this diplomatic talk, and ask him about this English arch-pirate they had all heard so much about operating out of Tunis. Anybody who has ever traveled outside of their home country, when there is somebody particularly notorious from their own country, knows this feeling. Everybody wants to ask you about this person, how you feel about them, what you might know about them, what can you tell them about this notorious figure. This was seriously handicapping Sir Anthony's ability to do business. So this noble gentleman turned privateer and convicted pirate jumped into action to deal with the renegade Englishman Jack Ward. Well, he wrote him a sternly worded letter. But it was fairly stern. Jack Ward received that letter from Sir Anthony in Tunis. Sir Anthony urged Ward, on his honor as a fellow Englishman and a Christian, to, quote, dissuade him from that wicked and villainous manner of living, end quote. Sir Anthony described the incumbent pain of hellfire, but then he offered Jack Ward a way out. This was a carrot and a stick. He gave him the stick of hell, and then for the carrot he offered to, quote, do his utmost to effect peace with all people if he might but prevail to call Ward in, or be the happy means to entice Ward rather to serve and bear arms with the Christians than the Turk, than to do the Turk service by robbing or spoiling Christians, end quote. He was offering Ward a way back, a way into the world. It was a way to earn forgiveness, not just the forgiveness of kings, but the forgiveness of God himself. But Jack Ward wouldn't have anything to do with it. Ward probably received the letter on board the recently captured Reiniera y Soderini. He also may have been in his palatial residence in the palace of the Treasury. But on board the Reiniera y Soderini, his men were working around the clock to outfit that giant Venetian ship for pirating, and they were doing quite well at it. She was a ship of 1,500 tons with 60 guns on 2 different decks. This was a powerhouse unlike almost any other ship sailing, and they did the typical pirate and privateer things. They stripped the sleeping quarters to make her a little bit lighter, and then they improved the rigging, and they cleaned the hull so that she would be as fast as possible. In a true and certain report of Captain Ward, Parker writes, quote, his mind was so inflated with pride and puffed up with vain glory that now he thought, nay, did not dare to speak, he was the sole and only commander of the sea, and indeed, like the sea, was always unsatisfied." End quote. News from the Sea, the pamphlet about Ward, says of Ward's response to the letter from Sir Anthony, quote, "What boots words to deaf ears, or reason to such as are wilfully bent to follow mischief? What, though he be able to triumph in his chains of gold, in his jewels of pearl and precious stone, or his other riches won by rapine and theft and the spoil of others? What, when he be able to boast of freedom? Nothing would take effect with Ward to seduce him from his courses, or to draw him to a lawful and regular kind of life." End quote. And nothing would draw him out of his way of life. Not the Venetian coast guard that was currently patrolling the sea for him, nor the Spanish galleons on his trail, not even the Dutch vessels looking for pirates, not even the squadron of English warships that had been sent down to the Mediterranean specifically to look for him. Ward felt very comfortable here. And that's some of that armchair psychohistory I mentioned earlier, but he must have felt comfortable. Not only did he have the Rainiere Sodorina, his new flagship, he still had Little John and Ruby and Carminati, as well as the Gift. The designs of those ships were different, but the firepower under John Ward's command equated to, by the standards that would be set down later by Admiral Pepys, a third-rate ship of the line, a frigate, or a fifth-rate ship, and 2 sixth-rate ships of the line, as well as a sloop of war. And those were only the ships that personally belonged to John Ward, captained by his lieutenants, men like Bill Graves and Richard Bishop and Anthony Johnson. In addition to those, he had a small fleet of smaller but powerful pirate vessels under his command, ships that would equate to frigates and sloops of war later on, or a little bit smaller maybe. Now those ships belonged to other captains, mostly English and Dutch, people like Sir Francis Verney, that young nobleman we discussed last time, but they were all in his fleet, under his command. So I have to imagine he felt very comfortable. As for Sir Francis Verney, he was not respected as a pirate. He wasn't even respected as a sailor. He was neither, really. But the assembled men were a bit enraptured by him. While their admiral, Jack Ward, was a gruff, low-born, drunken, foul-mouthed pirate, Francis Verney was every inch the well-born, well-educated, well-spoken nobleman. I imagine that somebody like that showing up, well, I imagine the Corsairs were a bit standoffish at first, but Verney very likely told them his tale of his wicked stepmother and the vile English Parliament. He could have told them tales of all of the oafish, fat sons of noble houses, and I bet the pirates would have liked that bit. And then he certainly would have told them about his time as a mercenary in Morocco. That would give him some credibility with the English. Now, the Dutch may have known about his family's role in their revolt already. If not, he could have told them about that, maybe even embellished that a bit. But that, including the fact that he served with Dutchmen in Morocco, would win him the Netherlands. Now, the rest of the pirates there in Tunis under Jack Ward, not the English or Dutch, but the Venetians and the Berbers and the Spaniards and the Janissary warriors, well, I imagine they would have been ambivalent to this noble fop and all of his charms, but he did bring in another ship and a few dozen more men and 20 or 30 guns, and that was always welcome. And if anyone was worried that this fancy young nobleman had come there to supplant their admiral and take over his position, well, all they had to do was to see how Francis Verney talked to John Ward, and all of their fears would have been allayed. Try to imagine it. 55 years old, short, bald, bearded, swarthy, Jack Ward. He was outfitted in gold and jewels and the best silks that money could buy. You know, I picture, and this is the worst comparison I could use, but do you remember in the 1991 Steven Spielberg movie Hook, the movie starring Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman and Julia Roberts? Bob Hoskins played the character of Shmi. Captain Hook's second-in-command. And there's a scene where, bald and short and stout and gray, Shmi is preparing to run. And he comes out of the cabin just covered in necklaces and rings and bracelets, and he's carrying goblets and candlesticks and I think a clock. That was kind of a thing with Captain Hook, right? Imagine that. Only instead of lovable Bob Hoskins, it's an angry old drunk who speaks primarily in grunts and profanity. He almost certainly suffers from some severe PTSD and severe delusions of grandeur. Imagine that standing on the quarterdeck of a beautiful, huge warship, and imagine him addressed by an eloquent, handsome, well-dressed young man. And then imagine him pledging his loyalty to Jack Ward. It would be clear from his demeanor that this young nobleman idolizes Ward. Ward was everything that Verney's family and estates and friends back at Oxford. Ward was everything that they weren't. In the eyes of Francis Verney, Jack Ward would have seemed just like so real, man. If anything, that image of the young, handsome, well-spoken nobleman deferring to their admiral, well, that would strengthen the resolve that those pirates felt in their following of Jack Ward. If someone like Verney actively sought out John Ward with the express intention of following him, of pledging his allegiance to him, then these pirates must have known that they were on the right side here. Or at least, I imagine, were I in their shoes, that's how I would feel. It's hard to say exactly how many pirate ships were in Jack Ward's fleet, aside from his own personal ships and that of Francis Verney. Those royal agents in the Barbary coast cities, as well as the later accounts and the accounts given by survivors of the pirate raids, can conflict with each other on occasion. There are names that may belong to different pirates or the same pirates. It's difficult to say due to the spelling. There are occasionally times when a single pirate will be named, but he will be in command of 3 or 4 ships. Oftentimes there were smaller fleets that had previously been operating out of Tunis or Algiers that came to sail under Jack Ward once he became such a famous and notorious pirate. And of course, those ships came and went. They may have had some allegiance to Jack Ward, or maybe not. Maybe the accounts just said they did to give Jack Ward a greater notoriety. Conservatively, I would estimate 12 ships. Those are the number that I can give a name to, of a captain or the ship itself. But it was probably significantly more than that, maybe 2 or 3 times that number. There are some chroniclers that would have you believe that there were hundreds of ships sailing under Jack Ward's command, but I don't give those any credence. Now, there may have been hundreds of ships sailing out of Tunis, corsairs of one stripe or another, but not all of them belonged or were even in any way under Jack Ward. He wasn't the admiral of the Tunisian Navy, he was the admiral of his own private pirate fleet. News from the sea, as well as one of the British chroniclers in Tunis at the time, tells us that around here is when Simon Dansicker joined up with Jack Ward. However, that's up for some debate. Simon Dansicker did sail either under or alongside Jack Ward at some point, but the timelines tend to contradict. It may have been shortly after arriving in Algiers and ingratiating himself with the Pasha there, or it may have been sometime a little bit later. He may have sailed with Jack Ward 2 or 3 times. Personally, I don't think that he ever sailed under Jack Ward as part of his fleet. I think they sailed together, maybe sort of an alliance. At this point, it seems that Simon Dansicker was not in Tunis. He was out in the Mediterranean on the prowl, but we'll more on that next time. In the fall of 1607, shortly after receiving that letter from Sir Anthony Shirley, Jack Ward set out to sea. The Rainiera Sodorina was fully armed and ready to sail. His armada was among the strongest in the Mediterranean. Now, of course, if it came to it, any seafaring state on the Mediterranean would be able to raise a fleet that could crush Jack Ward, perhaps without any significant and serious losses. But that's a hypothetical. Forces like that weren't just sailing around or sitting in harbor. the fleets of these Mediterranean states were separated. They were spread out. Take the biggest, the Spanish or Ottoman or Venetian fleets. They would have had Coast Guard regiments all over the place. Combine them and they would have significantly outnumbered Jack Ward's fleet, but Jack Ward was sailing in strength here. They did spread out a bit as they neared Italy, though. Now, we don't have an accurate record of the early days of this cruise, but we can extrapolate from a few of the ships that were reported taken, and one particular account, that Jack Ward sailed up the west coast of Italy first. Now, he didn't take any Italian ships on this cruise, not papal vessels or Genoan or Sicilian. He was sailing under the radar, as it were, trying to go unnoticed by the Italian authorities. But when he finally passed out of Italian territorial waters and into French territorial waters, or at least far enough out to sea that he wouldn't cause a ruckus back in Italy, he set his men loose. Any ship that was flying the French flag was fair game for Jack Ward's pirates. Now, this was fairly shocking to the people of southern France. Remember, the French were at least occasional allies of the Ottoman Empire. They had largely been exempt from the Mediterranean Barbary corsairs in the past. But Jack Ward and his crews were mostly English or Dutch. Those that weren't were mostly Venetian, Spanish, or native to the Barbary coast. None of those places were particularly fond of the French. The English were ancient enemies of the French. The Dutch and the Spanish both had territorial border disputes with them, and Venice had fought off more than a few attacks from French soldiers during the Italian wars. Now, the ships that he took weren't terribly large or particularly rich, but there was a blitzkrieg of French ships taken or captured or sunk during this period, and that sent the French into a state of, well, almost a state of shock, but then into a state of rage. The French marshaled a force of royal warships that were to sail out and destroy the pirates. But when they got out to sea, no one could find a hint of Jack Ward or his armada. He'd sailed in unnoticed, executed a barrage of piracy, taking dozens of ships' cargo and treasure, and then disappeared into the wind. There is one report of Jack Ward capturing a ship and crew that had the audacity to try and fight him, and then he sent the ship back to Tunis to be sold and the crew to be sold into slavery. And that wasn't what Ward was after here, but it did send a message. This was an act of retaliation. Normally, Jack Ward would just take the cargo, maybe the ship if it was particularly nice. But anyone who attempted to resist him would meet the same fate as those sent back to Tunis. But surrender your cargo and you can keep your ship and your freedom to sail home to your family. Most likely. And mostly that message worked. Now, some of the ships taken in this period that were attributed to Jack Ward were almost certainly not his doing. Dansicker was out there somewhere, just probably not sailing with Jack Ward. And most historians will agree that several of the ships captured by Captain Ward in the pamphlets and books written about him were actually captured by Dansicker. However, Ward had disappeared. Once again, he had fallen off the radar. Nobody knew where he was. Now, I know where he went, but I'm not going to tell you that quite yet. Once again, Jack Ward was staying out of the way of any ships he might come across. Even if the French did decide to warn the Italians or even the Spanish, and frankly they were unlikely to, that would take time for word to get to those other states. It would take time to muster those fleets, and they would be unlikely to catch up to him. Now, allow me to jump forward several months. We're going to look at a moment in which a letter arrived in London. A letter addressed to a group of rich investors and ship owners that were members of what you might call a proto-corporation that was involved in shipping and merchant affairs. That letter was sent from Lisbon, penned by a man named Daniel Bannister. Now, Bannister was the master of an English ship that belonged to that proto-corporation. That ship was the merchantman Charity. Now, after an introduction in the letter and a fair amount of boot-licking, Daniel Bannister begins by saying, quote, "So inconstant is fortune, so transitory is the state of man, so mutable are the seasons, and so lamentable are the travels of poor seafaring men." End quote. And then Bannister writes something in Latin that I can't read, but he goes on, quote, "From Lisbon we are now enforced to write, and we must entreat with you the patience to read of nothing but the world's period makers, death and destiny, of sorrow instead of prosperous success, of our lamentation at sea instead of bringing profit to shore." End quote. Now, if you were a rich investor in a corporation there in London, you probably didn't have the most up-to-date information on Jack Ward. However, you would certainly have agents reporting back to you about events in the Mediterranean region. You had interests there. It would be smart to do so. So you would have known that he was out there attacking French ships. And then radio silence until you receive that letter. Death and destiny, sorrow instead of prosperous success, lamentation at sea, and no profit. Now I'm going to skip over the paragraphs that follow that. It's a lot of woe is me, a poor sailor, and then a lot more praising of the investors. The traits that the investors tend to be praised for the most are their nobility and forgiveness and their sense of justice and how understanding they are. It's a little bit paper thin. But finally, Daniel Bannister gets to the point. On 15 March, the Charity put in at a Venetian port to trade the goods that they had in their holds for what the captain calls corn, but he means wheat, though. The voyage had sailed from London to trade wool in France initially, and it looks like in France they picked up some wine, which they then traded in Spain. Now, I don't know what they picked up in Spain, but this was the way of their voyage. They hopped from port to port, trading goods that would fetch a good price there for goods that would fetch a better price elsewhere. So everything was going well. Now, this was the penultimate stop, that one in Venice to pick up the wheat. That ship, the Charity, planned to trade that wheat in, I think in France, but maybe elsewhere in Italy. But their plan was to trade it there for good silver and make a huge profit. So after leaving that penultimate stop, the Charity headed south down the Adriatic until she was finally near the heel of Italy, the southeast corner of Italy. And there, the Charity encountered another ship. It was another English ship. And this one turned out to be the Pearl, out of London. And the Pearl was owned by that same group of rich investors, that same proto-corporation. In fact, the Pearl and the Charity knew each other, or at least knew of each other, and it turned out they were both headed out of the Mediterranean. Now, both captains and crews had heard some troubling whispers about pirates in the area. They always heard these sort of whispers, but they knew that there were pirates out there. So they decided that it would be smart to sail together, add a little extra protection. They made impressive time across the Mediterranean. They caught an excellent wind out of the east, what they call a levant, and they made it from Naples to almost the coast of Spain in 15 days. That's spectacular time. But Daniel Bannister then writes in that letter he sent to his bosses that on the 3rd of April, 1608, quote, "Many things happen between the cup and the lip. Man purposeth and God disposeth. That who trusts himself upon the pinnacles of fortune is readiest to fall under the tempest of ruin. The glorious morning sun is up early to awake us with the promise of a delightful day. Yet even then, by the overcharging of the clouds, the day is overcast, and our expectation frustrated. The sun hath forsook his promise to lend us his beams. Calmness is turned to tempests, and the fairness we had put hope on is turned to fearfulness." End quote. Now, that's not metaphor or allegory or poetic license. He's literally saying that the day turned very stormy. The waters grew choppy, and the Pearl and Charity were separated. Now they could still see each other, but they were far apart from one another. And that was when the pirates struck. It's unclear if Jack Ward was here at this moment, but I believe that he was. So you can picture a giant Venetian ship accompanied by at least 4 men of war surrounding the Pearl. Now that's not the ship that the author of that letter, Daniel Bannister, was on. He was observing all of this from a distance, and he thought for a brief moment that those ships might have been friendly ships there to lend aid in this terrible storm. A giant Venetian ship was probably a Venetian ship. But then Daniel Bannister watched in horror as the Pearl struck her sails and the crew of that Venetian giant boarded her. And then 3 ships broke away and made for the Charity. Bannister gave his ship all the sail he could, but his Charity was small. There were only 20 crewmen on board, and it had been at sea for some time. Those 3 vessels that were coming for him, well, they were well manned, full of sail, and according to Bannister, they were impeccably clean, as though they had just come out of port, he says. They were significantly faster. I take this to mean that at some point the crews had careened the ships on some island or inlet on the coast, but either way, those 3 ships came upon Charity swiftly. There was a ship on either side of Charity and then a 3rd ship at the stern. Now Bannister noted 3 things here, with terrible shock. First, he saw the telltale skin tone and clothing of the Janissary warrior. Those were fearful Turks, but they were of European origin. They had been forcefully turned from the one true faith. Bannister knew that those Janissaries lusted for the chance to kill good Christian men more than anything else. Now, that wasn't exactly true, but that was how Bannister saw things. And then second, Bannister saw that most of the faces on board those ships were not Janissary warriors, and when he heard them speak over the waves, he recognized many of their voices to be English. And they weren't slaves, they were working alongside the Turks, occasionally giving them commands. And then, perhaps the most shocking thing of all to Daniel Bannister, captain of the Charity, he realized he knew the captains of all 3 vessels. See, there were, according to the prevalent winds in the Mediterranean, a number of traditional trade routes, and Charity had run all of them during her years. Daniel Bannister knew all of them, and both Charity and Bannister were well known on the Barbary coast. The Barbary coast was an excellent place to pick up some exotic fruits, some spices, perhaps olives, but more than anything, beeswax. Beeswax was hard to come by in England, and it was all over the North African coast. Bannister realized that all 3 of the captains he saw around his vessel, well, they were captains that he had shared that route with in the past. Maybe not sailed with them, but sailed the same route. These were men that he, at some point, very likely had a drink with in a tavern somewhere to discuss prices or the weather or whatever ship captains discussed in 1605 in Algiers. But he tells us their names, at least their last names. He gives us ranks as well, but I'm not sure that they are accurate to their ranks in the pirate fleet. He says that the admiral of these 3 ships was a man named Captain Lynx. That ship carried 30 guns. What he calls the vice admiral was a man named Powell, and then the rear admiral, according to Bannister, was a man named Captain Foxley. Both of those prior 2 ships carried 28 pieces of ordnance. Now, those terms are probably a bit confused. Jack Ward was the admiral of the entire fleet, but it was common practice to rank the members of any given fleet, even a fleet of 3 tiny ships, in that fashion. And those ships may have been a part of a merchant convoy at some point in the past, and perhaps at that point, Lynx was the admiral, and Powell was the vice admiral, and Foxley was the rear admiral. But it seems that things had changed. Captain Bannister realized once he was fully stopped by those 3 pirate vessels. I do wonder if he had a moment of hope. He knew these men, perhaps they would spare him. But it became clear in short order that these once upstanding, honest merchantmen out of England had gone on the account. What Bannister called the rear admiral, Captain Foxley, was the man who hailed Bannister, and he appears to have been in command at this point. He told Bannister that, quote, "If we would not presently strike our topsail, thereby to show our yielding was immediate, they would lay us directly aboard with their ships and as readily sink us," end quote. Captain Bannister, and remember, this is according to a letter he was sending back to his investors and his bosses, so take it all with a huge grain of salt, Captain Bannister said he was prepared to fight. He shouted back at Foxley that he was, quote, as resolute to repel as his enemies were to offer, end quote, and that his men were all well armed and ready. As Bannister put it, quote, we were fitted to bid them welcome. And then he continues, such a hot entertainment should they find, as all the water that bare them should hardly bring them into a cool temper again, end quote. Now he was writing this in a letter, but he wrote it as though those were the words that he said to Captain Foxley. I think whatever Bannister really said, if he did in fact want to fight in the first place, was something a lot more like whatever the 1608 equivalent of "come at me, bro" might be. And, maybe that eloquence that he showed in that letter was the 1608 equivalent of "come at me, bro," the equivalent of two dudes puffing up their chests, but, well, I kind of doubt that. Either way, though, Captain Bannister did not strike sail, so the gunners on board all 3 pirate vessels shouted out orders and the crew began to load their guns. Hands ran up into the rigging, and the pilots on board the vessels set a course to encircle the Charity. And then, like sharks circling a piece of prey, the pirates brandished gleaming swords and held aloft all of their firearms. They screamed across insults and threats as they circled around the ship bearing their weapons. They weren't just threats of impending death, that was to be understood, but these pirates reminded those 20 sailors on board the Charity that when they were dead, other men would come in and claim their wives and their daughters, perhaps kill their sons and take their land. Still, though, according to Captain Bannister, the men on board Charity held on to their resolution. So, Captain Foxley came up with another idea. He barked out an order, and after a few moments, a gang of prisoners, all chained up in a line, a chain gang essentially, were marched out of the holds on deck. And then those prisoners began to address Captain Bannister and all of his men, and they addressed them in English. These prisoners in chains informed the crew of Charity that they were slaves. They were to be sold in Tunis, and their days, everything they had to look forward to, would be endless hours of pain and fear and torment and toil. They were beaten on board this ship. They were assaulted in the worst ways possible, and they were given barely enough food to survive to bring them to Tunis. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Some of them broke down, and any man who did was beaten down on the deck. Finally, Foxley barked out a final order, and all of the prisoners fell silent. Foxley looked up to Bannister, and he told them that these men were the last crew to offer him any resistance when he came upon them. But, Foxley said, Bannister and Charity had not yet fired a shot. No blood had been drawn on either side, and if they surrendered, Charity and the crew would all be allowed to go free. I think this is, it's a sort of a gamble. This is a last-ditch effort to convince Bannister to surrender peacefully. Now, if Bannister and the Charity believed Foxley here, they would almost certainly surrender. They don't want to be prisoners, obviously, and this is a losing battle. But if they don't believe you, if they think that you're going to take them as slaves, which you have just seen evidence that they're willing to do, well, they would have redoubled the fighting spirit of the men on board Charity. They would have been terrified. So this gamble could either turn out very well for Foxley and the pirates, or a little bit more difficult for him. However, in the end, it worked. Bannister tells us that he saw tears not only in the eyes of those enslaved, but in the eyes of many of the English pirates as well. He saw even a few of the Janissary warriors, he calls them the infidels, but he saw that some of them were even visibly moved by the tale of that pain. He saw that they knew what was ahead for those English prisoners. He saw that they knew how terrible it was going to be for them, and he saw that they were resolved to bring them to Tunis nonetheless. And then he saw his own men. He saw them trembling with fear. and he realized that their will to fight was breaking. I think what broke them here was, well, when they had been prepared to fight, they were fighting odds that certainly would have ended in their defeat. They were prepared to die, to defend their ship and their honor. If that were the case, they would have sunk down into the depths or died on deck with a bullet wound, and then they would have risen to heaven. But now they knew that that was not going to happen. Now they knew that they would not be allowed that sweet release. Instead, they would be enslaved for the rest of their lives. And that was what broke them. So, Captain Bannister signaled a surrender. The Charity was boarded, and the crew was loaded onto one of the 3 ships. They did so turn by turn. The first sailor was loaded onto one ship, and then the second sailor loaded onto a different ship, and then the third loaded onto the final ship. And then the fourth sailor would be loaded onto that first ship, but that would give them enough time to ensure that the first sailor brought aboard that ship would be under guard and not about to start any sort of trouble. It was a slow process, but it was the safest way to break up this crew and make sure that everybody had at least 2 men guarding him. Then Captain Bannister tells us, quote, "They presently came aboard us, fell violently to ransack, pillaging our traffic, cutting down our cabins, and smashing our chests to pieces, leaving us nothing to call our own but what we had on our backs. They took away all the powder we had, leaving us not so much beside as would prine one piece. They bereft us of most of our great shot, all our muskets, all our small shot, of our match, pikes, ladles, sponges, rapiers, swords, daggers, of all necessary munition for defense, leaving nothing with us but the vast sea and the unconstant wind to defend us." End quote. Now, every pirate ship throughout history put a priority on munitions and weapons. They were invaluable to the pirates. Next to the ships themselves, they were the most valuable tools of the trade. Honestly, they might prefer chests of silver and gold and rubies and pearls, but if those weren't available, they would prioritize the weapons above all else, unless they were starving and needed food, or, maybe there was booze on board. They might take that before the weapons, but the weapons third or fourth. But then, Bannister calls the cargo here traffic, and they took all of that, and then they went after the foodstuffs. They took the beef, they took the pork, they took something called cheese rise. Now, I'm not entirely certain what cheese rise is. He might mean yeast, or he may just mean cheese. But the pirates left the crew of the Charity only hard bread and a little water, and hardly enough of that to make it safely to shore. Now, this operation took several hours. The sailors of the Charity slept under guard that night. Or, it's probable they didn't sleep at all, but they spent the night under guard. Personally, were I in their situation, I would be terrified that we had been lied to. Those English sailors that we had seen were merely a ruse to get us to surrender peacefully and come on board, and now we're slaves. But come morning, Captain Foxley had all of the prisoners gathered, and he spoke to them in English. The Charity was pretty well picked over, but Captain Foxley lowered his voice. He looked over his shoulder and appeared to confide in these men who stood before him prisoners. He told them that, quote, "It was no way their intent, nor was it their Captain Ward's pleasure, that any private seafaring man's venture be in any ways hindered." End quote. And what Foxley was talking about here is, most merchant sailors would bring along a private cargo with them on their voyages, something that they personally owned and intended to trade. Usually it was something that they or their family produced. Sometimes it would be poor fare like wool or grain, but sometimes it would be textiles produced by their families, by their children and wives, sometimes fine clothes made out of that wool. Now, sailors would trade that personal cargo in much the same fashion as the other cargo on board. They would trade up and up and up until they had something that would be worth a good bit of coin back in England. This was the benefits package to supplement their abysmal wages. That's just how it worked. But Foxley was saying here that neither he nor his fellow captains nor Captain Ward, his admiral, wanted these men to lose their own personal possessions. These pirates weren't here to rob these men of their livelihood. They only wanted to rob their bosses, and that would only be of a little profit anyway. It fit well into the Robin Hood image of Captain Jack Ward. Not only did he have the Little John, but this proved that he preferred to steal from the rich and, well, if not give to the poor, at least he would spare the poor. But then Foxley said, quote, "These Turks, whom I doubt not but you have heard to be cruel enough, have as much command or more than ourselves. Wherefore, if you have anything that you would have defended from their grip, deliver it in trust to us. And as we are your countrymen, we will see it faithfully preserved, and upon your free discharge restored to you in full." End quote. Look, guys, we don't want to steal your stuff. We only want to steal your boss's stuff. But those guys, those scary infidels over there, well, they really do whatever they want. There's nothing I can do to stop them. But if you give us all of your goods, we'll make sure that they don't touch any of it. Swearsies. Now, I alluded to this a few weeks ago in a hypothetical, imaginary pirate attack, but it did really happen here. And it happened elsewhere as well, but this is the best account we have of it. The pirates, mostly Captain Foxley, convinced the crew of Charity to hand over their personal stashes of treasure. They promised to protect it from the Janissaries, but what choice did the crew of Charity have? They could refuse and allow the Janissaries to maybe torture the location of that treasure out of them, tear the ship apart until they found it, and maybe, just maybe, Captain Foxley was being honest here. Maybe he really didn't want to steal from these Englishmen. There was a certain code amongst mariners, especially mariners that were countrymen, not to harm one another. So Captain Foxley and the Englishmen squirreled away their personal treasures. And then their bonds were cut free. The crew of the Charity was brought back on board the Charity. It appears that any fears they may have had of enslavement were not the case. They were going to be allowed to go free. And then the crew of the Pearl was brought over to the Charity. The pirates wanted the Pearl, as it turned out, but they were set free on board the Charity as well. They had food, they had water, and they had their lives. It appeared that the pirates had been honest to their word. Well, they had been honest to their word when it came to not selling them as slaves in Tunis. Captain Bannister notes with almost a sense of wry amusement that Foxley and the other pirates sailed away with all of their goods on board. And once again, that is according to Captain Bannister. Perhaps there is the smallest possibility that Captain Foxley did follow that code. Perhaps he did give them back their personal effects, their personal cargo. This may have been the case. He did, after all, know Bannister. He probably knew most of the crew. But assume that you had been captured by pirates. You lost all of the cargo that belonged to your rich and powerful investors. Would you let them know that you had a few chests of treasure on board after the pirates had taken all of their goods? Or would you maybe find an abandoned bit of coastline somewhere, bury that treasure, and then write an elaborate tale of how it too had been stolen from you by those vile pirates? All we have to go on is what Bannister told us, and he says that Foxley took the treasure. And frankly, I don't see any reason to not believe him, but I find it equally likely that perhaps Bannister was bending the truth here. I think I know what I would do. Next time, we're going to talk about the effects of this particular pirate attack. In some ways, the response to this raid was even bigger than that of the Rainiera y Soterina. Then we will go on to discuss the fates of the Charity, and we will continue our story of Jack Ward and Simon Dansicker. Throughout most of 1608, Simon Dansicker was a particularly active pirate. In fact, he may have been the most active pirate, at least in the Mediterranean. After his stint in Algiers, teaching the Algerian shipwrights how to build round ships and gaining the trust and protection of Redouan Pasha, Simon Dansicker went out on the cruise. Now, John Ward may have been responsible for more ships captured and more slaves brought in than Simon Dansicker. His Tunisian fleet, well, it was massive. There were ships under his command sailing out there, capturing ship after ship after ship. They were all very busy, and he had many of them. In fact, according to an agent of King James, a man named Henry Pepwell, Simon Dansicker actually sailed under John Ward's flag for a few months here, but that didn't last long. Dansicker set out on his own and immediately began to make a name for himself. Among the pirates that were operating out of Tunis, Dansicker became something of a figure of competition and even jealousy, and, probably some admiration and respect. Dansicker distanced himself from the pack so quickly that it was immediately clear he was a cut above most of the captains active in Barbary. He was on the same level as their admiral, as John Ward. Among everyone back in Europe, though, Dansicker was becoming something darker. He was becoming a real boogeyman. To the Venetians and the Nepalese and the Spanish and English and French, Dansicker was quickly supplanting Ward as the most watched and most feared pirate sailing in the Mediterranean. And Dansicker still hadn't taken any really serious prizes. He had taken nothing to compare with the Rainiera Isodorina, but the capture of that Venetian vessel was months ago now. Ward was busy in Tunis outfitting his new flagship. He was content to let his sub-commanders capture whatever they could, but he was busy at home. Meanwhile, though, Dansicker was even busier. He was out there on the prowl, and there were a few defections over to Dansicker, from sailors among Ward's fleet, even from captains and ships among Ward's fleet. At first there were only a few. Maybe they wanted a change of scenery, but by the end of today's show it will become a flood of defections. At first, there were just a few smaller ships, captained by some small-time pirates, that joined up with Dansicker just to take a ship that normally would have been too large for them. They would split the booty after the prize was taken and go on about their way. They didn't necessarily join up with Dansicker, just allied with him for a time. But imagine that you were a pirate operating a relatively small craft in the Mediterranean. You capture a ship and, oh, yay, it's 76 tons of wheat again. And then you see someone with an equally small ship, even perhaps a smaller ship, and they bring in silk and sugar and silver. Well, how did they do it? They did it by teaming up with Simon Dansicker. Ward sat in port tinkering with his baby, but Dansicker was out there getting rich and making other people rich as well. It might actually be unfair to call these defections. Ward and Dansicker weren't at war with one another. It wasn't as though they were going over to the enemy camp. On the whole, they were friendly. They knew each other. They'd even worked together at one point. Their sub-commanders and crews knew each other as well. They were comrades of a sort. But you have to imagine that John Ward would feel a little pang of trepidation and maybe even some anger and even fear every time one of his ships, a member of his fleet, sailed in with a rich haul, care of that Dutchman Simon Dansicker. And most Dutch pirates would have been more comfortable sailing with a Dutch admiral. England and the Netherlands were friendly, yes, but those old national allegiances weren't entirely dead among the pirates, so we see a large number of Dutch captains go over to Simon Dansicker. Dansicker himself famously refused to attack Dutch shipping. Now, this wasn't an absolute rule, and we'll see him break that rule today, but on the whole he tried to stay away from attacking his countrymen. And that, combined with a lot of other attitudes and actions of Simon Dansicker, prove that, while John Ward claimed to be a Robin Hood of the high seas, complete with Little John, Simon Dansicker was living the life of a noble thief. He did rob from the rich and give to the poor. At least, he did more so than John Ward did. He did spare his countrymen, usually, and Simon Dansicker was well known for stealing only the cargo belonging to rich investors. The personal possessions and the freedom of his fellow mariners were never, or at least rarely, on the table. Case in point here, when Jack Ward's 3 ships under Captain Foxley attacked the Charity and the Pearl, what we talked about last time, Foxley tricked the sailors of Charity to hand over their personal wealth. They stole their wages and their earnings on that voyage. They stole, well, what would feed their families back home. Foxley said that it was to protect those possessions, but he lied. He left those sailors destitute out there. But that was not how Simon Dansicker did business, and he was about to prove it. This is episode 90 of Angels and Devils. So let's return to the story of the Charity from last time. The crews of both the Charity and the Pearl were all put aboard Charity when those 3 captains under Foxley set them free. They had a bit of water and biscuit to keep them alive, but virtually nothing else. Captains Lynx, Powell, and Foxley, all 3 of them Ward's men, took all of their munitions. They took every gun, every piece of shot, every ounce of powder, every sword, every axe. They took everything down to the last dagger. The men of the Pearl and Charity had nothing with which to defend themselves. They barely had enough to feed themselves or even sail safely for shore. This was a desperate situation, and it's one that, to me at least, belies the Robin Hood mythos of John Ward. Now, Ward wasn't there, and perhaps had he been, he would have insisted on a more humane treatment of his victims, especially since they were his countrymen. According to some European agents operating there in Barbary, Ward was as loath to attack English ships as Dansicker was to attack the Dutch. But that's not true. Ward did attack English ships all the time. The Little John was an English ship. The York Bonaventure was an English ship, and a number of others. However, that still remains a part of his myth. Regardless, the sailors on board the Charity sailed away. They were defeated and they were dejected. However, they were alive and free, and sometimes that's all one can ask for. They were still in sight of the 3 pirate ships who had taken them captive. Well, now there were 4, including the Pearl, when they saw another ship arrive on the horizon. This was a French vessel, and those 3 pirate ships made right for her. Now that French ship on the horizon made a run for it, but to no avail. She prepared to fight. She even got off a salvo. That's a courageous decision, the decision to fight, especially facing down such long odds. Perhaps the French were unable to communicate with the English pirates, or maybe the pirates just gave her fewer chances to surrender, due to their being French, or perhaps the French sailors just preferred to fight. Maybe they wanted to go out honorably. The last image that Captain Bannister, the captain of Charity, saw of that French vessel as his ship sailed away was the merchant, master, and mate, all 3, hanging from the yardarm. And I wonder about this story. I wonder about Captain Bannister's entire narrative. Remember, he was writing all of this from Lisbon some time later, and it was the first word that his English bosses had received about 2 of their ships. Now, I don't have any evidence to suggest that his story might not be accurate. There is no positive information suggesting that he might not be telling the truth, but it still seems suspect to me. What gets me is the timing of the 3 ship captures. First, the Pearl surrendered immediately. The second, Charity, almost put up a fight. They were brave, honorable, courageous Englishmen after all, and they were willing to fight the cargo of their rich investor bosses, but they were also smart. They were smart enough to surrender when it was clear that resistance would be futile. And if you need proof that resistance would have been the foolish path, all of my bosses back in London, you only have to look to that French ship and the death and slavery that followed for the crew. And of course the French would do something that foolish. They're French after all. It's just a little bit too perfect. And Bannister may have been telling the full and honest truth here. But if he is, the saga of Charity serves almost as a perfect parable about pirates and how to deal with them. However, even if it isn't true, we still have to believe. It's the story we have. Now, I bring this up because things are about to become even less credible. The following day, the day after Charity was set free and saw that French vessel captured, the Charity was making her way to the coast of Spain when they saw another ship. Bannister writes of that time, quote, "After we had discharged ourselves of the bad, we were subject to fall into the jaws of worse. Now, being eagerly pursued by a bloody French man of war, a pirate like the other, of whose cruelty we had heard so much before, we counted ourselves in the arms and grip of death. For 2 days and a night this French pirate had us in chase, and the wind beginning to grow calm, he was come within a mile of us. The nearer we perceived him, the nearer we judged our sudden destruction." End quote. There were 40 or so men on board Charity, and they knew to a man that they had no hope of victory. They had no guns, they had no swords, they didn't even have a dagger on board. Every tool with which they could have defended themselves was taken from them. Now, Bannister says that he knew who this devilish French pirate was, but he doesn't tell us who it was. Perhaps it was one of Ward's ships, or perhaps it was one of Dansicker's. More likely, though, she was an independent vessel operating out of Barbary or even France. There were French Barbary pirates and French privateers in the region, but even the pirates operating out of Barbary from France were sort of an inclusive and almost nationalistic lot. They tended not to join up with the English or the Dutch. Still, that French vessel, that French pirate, would have had less compunction capturing the crew of Charity and selling them into slavery than the Englishmen under Ward did. The English pirates might take your cargo and your guns and most of your food in one of your ships, but the English among them would still hesitate at capturing other Englishmen to be sold into slavery. Even though they were willing to, it wasn't exactly what they wanted to do. But the French didn't share that. Not about the English. I'm sure that they would be less willing to sell other Frenchmen into slavery, but in the same way that the English would be more willing to sell a Frenchman, the French were more willing to sell the English. You get what I'm saying here. The crew of Charity, though, resolved that in this moment they would not be taken alive. They all refused to be enslaved. Every last one of them prayed and made what peace they could with God. Bannister says that they prepared to meet that from whom we can never expect mercy. However, as they prepared to fall on their swords or perhaps jump ship and try to swim for safety, or perhaps both and let themselves sink into the depths, we can imagine that they fervently hoped for that mercy. Bannister says they were void of all fear, but I have trouble believing that. He writes, quote, "When we least thought of help, when all expectation of rescue was frustrate, when we had given our lives and our bodies to ye seas, it pleased God to send inside of us 5 ships under sail." End quote. So let's take a quick look at the timeline here. Charity and Pearl were attacked on day 1. They spent a night in chains and were set free on day 2. They saw another ship attacked on that same day. On 3, they were pursued by a French ship overnight and all of day 4. At the end of day 4, they run into 5 ships under sail. Now, for me, I tend toward the cynical. I try not to. I try to look at the brighter side, but I still tend to see the worst in a situation. But in the eyes of everyone aboard the Charity, this was a miracle. They made for those 5 ships. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know their nationality. They didn't know if they were pirate ships, but they did know that the ship chasing them was a pirate with violence and terror in mind. And you know that saying, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't? In this case, the devil they didn't know may just have been an angel in disguise. They realized that a danger was behind them, and even if danger lay ahead of them, there was at least a potential for rescue. And it was a dangerous move. For a moment, let's set aside the possibility that they were pirates. Let us assume that these 5 ships were friendly merchantmen. Imagine that you were the captain of a merchant ship in a convoy, and you saw an English ship sailing in fast in waters in which English pirates were known to be nearby. Wouldn't you arm yourself and prepare to defend against attack? Isn't there a possibility that you would fire first and ask questions later? It was the safest course of action. Bannister was well aware of that possibility. But the devil you don't know, and all of that. Bannister writes, quote, "We made all the speed we could to get up to them. The Frenchmen, on the contrary, strove as much to cut us off from our purpose. We guessed they, the 5 ships, might discern our inward mystery by our outward signs. We expressed the lively motions of distressed men by kneeling on the knees and holding up our hands. They, perceiving, though not knowing what we were, in charity made up to us. The Frenchmen, considering, sprang aloof and left us." End quote. So charity sailed for those 5 ships as fast as possible. They showed themselves to be desperate men by assuming the positions of beggars or maybe of penitents. The strangers saw that and sailed up, so their French pursuer sailed off. And maybe it was a miracle. They weren't pirates. It turned out that they were English ships, 4 of them at least. One of them was Flemish. They were merchants, and they were friendly. The flagship was the Prosperous, and her master was one Captain Sartop. The men of charity praised God and thanked their saviors. Some of them fell to their knees, some to pray and some to kiss the feet of their saviors. Others fell from sheer relief. They had, at long last, been saved. And, weren't these seas just amazingly crowded? Not only the 3 pirate ships belonging to Ward, but the Charity, the Pearl, that French merchantman that was captured, the French pirate, and these 5 ships here. That's 12 ships meeting within 4 days. Not one of them was Spanish either, and they were just off the coast of Spain. Where's the Coast Guard? Where are these Spanish merchant galleons? I don't know, but they weren't here. However, Charity was finally safe to sail on toward the coast of Spain. They had left the pirates behind and found succor. So let's leave them to it and turn our attention to Captain Simon Dansicker. Unfortunately, much like John Ward, in the early days of Dansicker's pirate career, we don't have any of these wonderful first-hand accounts like that of Charity. There's nothing like that letter telling us the ins and outs of their battles and their struggles. So the early days of his career are a little bare bones. Early on, it's hard to say what captured ships in the Mediterranean could actually be attributed to Simon Dansicker. Ward's fleet was out there capturing ships. There were other unaffiliated corsairs on the prowl, so it's tough to track down exactly where Dansicker was. There were pirates out of not only Tunis and Algiers, but Tripoli and Salé in Morocco. This was one of those post-war periods when privateers went rogue and turned pirate in droves. This is the major pattern in the story of piracy. We see it time and time again after the Franco-Dutch War and after the War of Spanish Succession, among many others. But right now there were so many pirates sailing that for any single name to stand out, they have to pull off something huge. And Simon Dansicker does stand out, because he pulled off what Adrian Tenniswood calls a major coup. Earlier in the year, Simon Dansicker was off the coast of Valencia, the east coast of Spain. That's just a little bit south of where the Charity was when she was captured, and they were near the Balearic Islands. Dansicker spotted a convoy of Spanish ships on the horizon. They were captured, and they were found to be carrying grain. Now, grain was actually a pretty good haul for Dansicker's purposes. I may have mocked another 76 tons of corn earlier, but Dansicker was happy with it. Remember, he was the admiral of the Algerian Navy under Pasha Redouan. He was building a fleet, hoping to rival those in Europe. Any time he captured a cargo of wool or linen or grain or timber, and timber was a big one here, it would be useful for his fleet. They were always happy with guns and powder and shot and cold steel and tools and tar and everything that was needed to run a navy. So the grain was useful here. If it was the grain, though, it would have just been another in a long line of unremarkable hauls that we probably wouldn't remember. However, that grain convoy was carrying two particularly valuable pieces of human cargo. On board the flagship Baena, Simon Dansicker found two young men. One was the son of the Viceroy Sandoval of Majorca, largest of the Balearic Islands. The other was the illegitimate son of the Viceroy Villena of Sicily. They would fetch impressive ransoms, but even that was nothing compared to what they were carrying. They had in their possession 300,000 Spanish crowns in gold. Now, this was a common tactic employed by the Spanish. More than a few times in our story, pirates have, and will in the future, stumble upon some unbelievably rich prize. They were totally unsuspecting of it. The Spanish did this a lot. Just a normal grain convoy, nothing to see here, move along. Certainly no rich, noble sons on board with a chest filled with gold coins. This was the exact opposite of their huge, well-armed treasure fleets. They were hiding in plain sight, and usually, presumably, they made it to their destination with no trouble. They continued doing it for decades and decades, so we have to assume that it usually went well. But imagine what sort of a dramatic situation this must have been for those two young men. Unfortunately, we don't have a first-hand account like that of Captain Bannister. All we have are the official Spanish reports, but what must that have been like for young Sandoval and Villena? Imagine their furious arguments on board with the captain of the Baena. Imagine them ordering him to sail on and make a run for it, or to fight the pirates when it finally came down to it. Imagine them in their cabin, furiously trying to hide a huge chest of gold, or maybe they rushed to one of the more humble cabins on the ship and traded clothes with some of the men. Maybe they hid their gold and swords away and tried to blend in with the crew. They perhaps locked the door, and maybe they sat there preparing to kill to keep their treasure safe. Because this wasn't their money, they weren't just two rich boys on board. This was almost certainly a private payment from Sicily to Majorca, or maybe Valencia. This would have been of the utmost importance, more than likely. And now, once they were found, it was in the hands of Captain Simon Dansicker. He returned home after his raid on Baena, in possession of 300,000 crowns, 2 noble hostages, and a convoy of grain ships. The Pasha, Redouan, commended Dansicker for this, and it earned the Dutch pirate a new name in Algiers. In Turkish, they called him Dali Rais. In English, the Devil Captain. Suddenly, back in Europe, his name started appearing in a bunch of official communications, where once Jack Ward would have taken credit or maybe taken the blame for something like this, Simon Dansicker was receiving both for all of his exploits. And he went back out there. The Devil Captain went back on the prowl. He captured another grain convoy. He captured more than a few merchant ships, and he even began making grandiose gestures against those who he felt had wronged him. He threatened to blockade the harbor of the fort at Ibiza, another of the Balearic Islands. He did sail around for a while, looking very intimidating with what appeared to be a growing fleet. One of the ships was in fact that grain convoy's refitted flagship, Baena. But what's so striking about Dansicker, even though we have fewer accounts that have filtered down to us, is his style. Remember in Harry Potter and I think it's the Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore summons his pet phoenix and vanishes in a brilliant flash of fire, and Kingsley says, "You may not like him, Minister, but you have to admit, Dumbledore's got style." Well, that sort of sentiment was being quietly expressed there in Europe. There was something almost fun. There was something theatrical about how Simon Dansicker operated. First of all, he was less prone to taking slaves, and second, whenever he did take a ship, well, it kind of reminds me of Blackbeard. he built this larger-than-life, terrifying pirate menace image. He would sail in and overwhelm a ship with the mere presence of himself, and then he would command the sea like a stage. He would pull off what were some frankly impressive nautical maneuvers and then bellow over commands in a huge sea commander's voice. One captain, a captain of a ship called the Swan, reported that Dansicker bellowed over in what was kind of a hybrid of English and Dutch, quote, "Aha, Swan, thou binst mine," end quote. And he would leave most of his ships behind and sail on alone to meet whatever ship he was trying to capture. But then he would tell the ship's master to strike sail and follow him. Now, Dansicker and whomever the captain might be might deliberate on that point, but if they did, then Dansicker's fleet would ensnare the ship in a net. The captain would invariably, in that situation, knowing that that was going to be the outcome, strike sail and follow Dansicker. Now, I don't want to lionize Simon Dansicker here. He was a thief, he was just a pirate, and he would kill men if he had to take their cargo. But much like Blackbeard, the devil captain built an image that ensured, well, more often than not, that he wouldn't have to kill anyone. So, Captain Dansicker was building a name for himself in those early months, not just in Algiers and not just in Barbary, but in Europe. And here he began to rival Ward in notoriety. As I said, those early months were a bit bare bones, but now let's return again to the Charity, sailing toward the coast of Spain with that convoy. Captain Bannister's letter, which would be written later, still had a final chapter. After that chase from a French pirate and the miracle of a rescue at sea, Bannister writes, quote, "Life is not permanent. No more are our fortunes. We have joy in this moment and sorrow in the next. We come crying into the world, and we must go weeping out. Scarce had our joy felt an hour of embracement, when presently we might find ourselves the third time to be had in chase by a man of war and his pinnace, who, drawing near up to us, we perceived was Captain Dansicker of Algiers. His ship is so potent that it seemed to us resistless, for he carried 55 pieces of ordnance, besides 40 Turks. Comes he amongst the thickest of our fleet as if he had the power to sweep us away with his breath." End quote. It was 5 days after Charity had been attacked the first time when Simon Dansicker found them. It was mere hours after that French man-of-war gave up the chase, and Dansicker found Charity in the company of 5 other armed ships. They weren't men of war, they weren't even Coast Guard ships, but they were merchant ships, so they had guns, and they did have the ability to surround Dansicker's vessel and bombard her. But Dansicker was sailing a large ship filled with ordnance and men who were capable of deadly violence. Resistless, Bannister calls it. The Dutch pirate could have blown them out of the water had he chosen to, but of course that's not the goal in piracy. Instead, Simon Dansicker just sailed in among the other ships and allowed himself to be surrounded, as though he could blow them away with his breath. The fleet, this merchant convoy, could have opened fire on him. They could have hit him from every angle, except for 2 things. The first here is purely tactical. Imagine a group of 6 ships. They would be arrayed sort of like a circle of wagons here. Ships were a bit more difficult to maneuver than a wagon, but generally in a rough circle, if more spread out. Then a large man-of-war sails into their center. There was little they could do to stop Dansicker from doing this. They weren't lined up or prepared for battle. But now Dansicker was surrounded. They could have opened fire. But then, what happens if they miss? Arrayed in that rough circle, the possibility of friendly fire would go up significantly, and most of their shots would have missed unless they were in very close quarters. Even 200 years later, even 300 years later, most naval shots missed. It was very hard to make a direct hit on another ship. If you wanted to, you would have to get in very close. But if any of these ships got in close enough to guarantee a hit on Dansicker, well, Simon Dansicker had those 400 men on board. Bannister continues, quote, "He caused his followers to waft us amain with their glistening swords, threatening to sink us the one after the other if at his command we did not immediately strike." End quote. Simon Dansicker had every man on board lift his saber into the air and scream threats at the men on board. So, getting in close was a poor idea. So tactically it made some sense for Simon Dansicker to sail in. He was still surrounded. He hadn't, taken the hill in command of the battlements, but it was a bad situation for Charity and her 5 companions. The second thing that kept them from fighting, though, was Dansicker himself. They knew who he was. He was the Devil Captain. He was that larger-than-life, theatrically threatening villain. And compare that to Jack Ward. Now, Ward was scary, make no mistake, but he was scary because he would kill you, and he would sell you as a slave. He was brutal. But Simon Dansicker had that certain villainous panache that we've come to expect from pirates. I mean, who would have the guts to just sail into an assembled group of ships and demand their surrender? And not only to demand it, but actually expect it of them. That person is someone of whom you should be very afraid, or at least that's what Simon Dansicker was hoping those ships would think. Perhaps it's just because Halloween is coming up, but when I think about the two of them, I think about the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, Freddy and Jason. John Ward is sort of a Jason character. He's quiet, he's brutal, he's deadly, and that makes him terrifying. But Simon Dansicker over here is much more of a Freddy Krueger. He's a lot more theatrical. He enjoys the thrill of the hunt and making you afraid, and that's what makes you fail. He doesn't just hit you with a giant machete or a chainsaw or a harpoon or a spear or any of the other tools that Jason used. He likes to scare you in your dreams, and that is how he gets you. And that is, that's bad. You don't want that to happen. But Freddy Krueger, from our point of view, years in the future or watching it on a TV screen, well, he's a lot more fun. He's a fun villain. And that's what Simon Dansicker had going here. And the fleet of English ships and that one Flemish vessel, well, they felt it too. Master Sartop, the admiral of the fleet, struck sail and waited for Dansicker, as commanded. Now, 2 of his ships, 2 of the English vessels that were sailing under Sartop, sailed in beside him before Dansicker was able to get close, and they begged him to hoist sail and prepare to fight. They believed that if they worked together, they could best him. And they might have been right. They probably had the numerical advantage in guns, or at least angles from which to shoot down Dansicker. But Sartop refused. He had made up his mind to surrender here. And, frankly, that was probably the smart move. Now, the Flemish ship and Charity were to the leeward of Sartop and Dansicker. That means that any attempt to run, had they hoisted sail and made a break for it, they would have fallen right in the path of Simon Dansicker. They had no way to escape. The other ships, though, saw in Sartop's surrender a chance to escape, and they took it. The 3 who were downwind hoisted sail and made a break for it. Now, they didn't have the happiest of fates in the end. They were, a little bit later on, captured by pirates. Now, that's not surprising considering the shocking density of pirate population here off the coast of Spain in 1608, and because they were fools, they fought those pirates, and they were sold as slaves back in Barbary. But Sartop, the Flemish vessel, and the Charity had fallen into the hands of Simon Dansicker, the Devil Captain, notorious arch-pirate and scourge of the Mediterranean, one of the most feared men alive. Now, Captain Sartop was safe here. Dansicker cut a deal with him. Bannister says that Dansicker promised, quote, he would never ransack nor pillage anything from him, end quote. He made that deal on the condition that Sartop surrender. It's why he refused to hoist sail and fight, and it was intended to convince this little fleet of his to do likewise. That's what Dansicker wanted. He wanted everything to go smoothly here, and if the admiral surrendered, the rest of the fleet was likely to. Now that didn't work out. Those smaller ships ran, but, well, I don't know who captured them. But I like to imagine it was another ship under Dansicker's command who was waiting out there to capture anyone foolish enough to flee. I enjoy picturing Simon Dansicker as that cunning and that devious. But again, he kept to his word here. He spared Sartop because Sartop did as was asked. Now, the fate of that Flemish vessel is a bit ambiguous. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it doesn't go unscathed here. And I realize that earlier I said Dansicker famously never attacked Dutch ships except for rare occasions. I also realize that this is the first Dutch ship we have seen him come in contact with, and he takes it immediately. So maybe I just prefer Freddy Krueger to Jason Voorhees, and I am giving him more credit than was his due. But then again, keep that in mind, because I may not be. But Charity had been ransacked and left without any munitions. Dansicker sailed up to Charity and told Bannister and his 40 or so men that they were commanded to strike sail and follow him. Bannister obviously agreed. He didn't have much choice here, but Bannister tells us, quote, we entreated him to be good unto us, and told him that we had been robbed by the Tunis man-of-war, Confederates of Ward, only 5 days before. Captain Dansicker demanded of Master Sartop whether the relation of our surprisal was true or no, who affirmed it to be true. When Dansicker, like a proud, yet we may call him an honest pirate, told us that since the men of Tunis had us in hand, he scorned to rob a hospital, to afflict where there was misery before, or to make prey of them who had nothing left. End quote. Don't you just love that? Dansicker sailed in boldly, demanded surrender, and when he received that surrender, he stuck to his own personal code of honor. Dansicker sent a message over to Charity. He said that he would spare them if only they shot off a 3-gun salute to him. Now, the Charity didn't have any guns. They had, quote, not so much left whereby to gratify his courtesy, end quote. I can only imagine the terror and panic that ran through the men. What do? We can't do as he asks. Oh, God, he's going to kill us. So Bannister sent the messenger back to tell Dansicker that they didn't have any guns. All of their guns had been taken. So Dansicker let them go free. I think this was an incredibly clever move. I think Dansicker was testing Charity to see if they were lying. If they had 3 guns to fire, they were lying, and he would have taken everything they had on board, including the crew. And I know that I may be giving him too much credit here, but that sounds terribly likely. Before the Charity left, though, the crew of the Pearl, who was on board Charity at this point, decided to ask Dansicker a favor. They sent a messenger over, and that messenger said, quote, how uncertain was our hope, and how continual was the danger, since every ship we saw we must fear to be a pirate, we entreated of Dansicker that he would be pleased to set us ashore. End quote. And would you believe it, Simon Dansicker agreed. He agreed to take the men of the Pearl on board and set sail for the coast of Spain, where he would set them free. He did so as an act of kindness to ensure that they wouldn't be bothered by any further pirates. And then do you know what he did? He gave them money. He gave every member of the crew of the Pearl 4 shillings to ensure that they could make it safely to civilization. I mean, what? Can you believe that? I kinda can't. I feel like Captain Bannister was lying to us in the letter. I don't know why. I don't have a conflicting account here, but I mean, really? He took this crew to shore, and he paid them money. It's like, look, guys, I was going to rob you, but then I didn't, so here's some money. Is this guy actually Robin Hood? Is the real Robin Hood of the high seas a Dutchman rather than an Englishman? That's kind of a line in the sand, right? I mean, there will be an English pirate much later on who fits this Robin Hood myth a little, but I'm saying it now. These English pirates who died hundreds of years ago, well, they have to up their game. If they want to hold on to that little bit of English mythology of the noble robber, they have to do a lot better than they are right now, than they did during the entire buccaneering era. Because as it stands, the title of most noble pirate ever, Robin Hood of the High Seas, that goes to Simon Dansicker. And as for the Flemish ship, Dansicker did take some of her cargo. She was carrying mostly corn, but a few Mediterranean goods as well. And Dansicker took some of that corn and some of the wine and water on board, and he gave it to the charity. I see you're short of provisions here, so I'm going to literally rob from the rich and give to the poor here. This guy is amazing. And he did take some of their other cargo for himself to pad his coffers, but he didn't take all of it, and he made certain that everything he did take belonged to the bosses, to their rich investors. He refused to touch anything that belonged to, quote, the adventures of private men, end quote. Ward's man, Foxley, lied and cheated and stole everything from the crew of the Charity. And I mean, that's super piratical, lying, cheating, stealing. That's kind of what the whole game is about. But then you think about how he left their children to go hungry because their fathers had no money left at all. And then Dansicker. He took extra care to ensure that that did not happen. I know I'm gushing here, but I just don't care. I love this pirate. Charity was allowed to sail away. They had only their own 20 men left on board and holds that were filled with at least a bit of... Well, actually, I'd like to address something here. I was recently corrected, but I'm less than sure about it. But apparently, supplies on board a ship should be called properly victuals, even though they still had the French spelling of victuals. I've heard people from certain linguistic regions of the United States say victuals, and honestly, I had no idea what they were talking about, but there are a lot of strange occasions when pronunciations would jump from England in 1700 to some of the more remote mountain communities in North America that just never changed. But Charity finally had victuals to make it safely to shore, or, if they wished, probably enough to make it home. But that wasn't what Bannister had in mind. As we know, they stopped in Spain so their captain could write a letter explaining just why they had lost all of their cargo. You don't want to show up with nothing in your holds and expect your bosses to understand without at least a little bit of warning. But Prosperous, the flagship, and that Flemish vessel, well, they were ordered to sail off with Captain Dansicker. They were not a hospital. Bannister writes, quote, Mr. Sartop and his whole company he, Dansicker, carried away directly for Algiers, where what will succeed unto them is yet uncertain. And I am fairly certain that their uncertain fate was to join up with Simon Dansicker and turn pirate on the Barbary coast. A part of me suspects that this may have been the plan the entire time, but I don't know that. Regardless, if they weren't pirates before, I think that those two vessels will be now. But at long last, Bannister and the crew of Charity were finally safe. As for Dansicker, though, when he returned to Algiers, he began to hear troubling rumors. He was a hero, at least to the people of Algiers. He was on top of the world in the Mediterranean. But the word was rumbling around that Captain Ward had been gone a little too long. He'd left Tunis some time before. His giant Venetian flagship, Rainiera y Soderina, hadn't been seen in some time. Quite a long time, in fact. And then, even more troubling, rumors began to spread that the Soderina was sunk in waters in the Aegean, and that Captain Ward was dead. Now, Dansicker and Ward may have been rivals at times, but they knew each other and were, after a fashion, friendly. And more to the point, it ensured security from all sides to have more pirates who were at least relatively friendly operating on the coast of Barbary. Should the Ottoman Empire decide to exert their influence, Simon Dansicker would be happy to have wards sailing alongside him. Should Spain or Venice or France or England or the Netherlands decide to mount an offensive against Tunis or Algiers, they would be happy to have somewhere to run and perhaps friends to help them fight. So if Ward was dead, this was a deeply troubling rumor. Next time, we'll find out exactly what John Ward had been up to ever since he left those French and Italian waters so many months ago, and we will discuss his fate and the end of Captain Jack Ward. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who has helped to support the show, everybody who has become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us a rating or a review or recommended the show on the internet or in real life. Without all of you, I couldn't do this, so thank you.